The story of the Gaels begins not on the windswept shores of Ireland or in the Highland glens of Scotland, but in the heart of Bronze Age Europe, where a complex web of cultural and linguistic developments would eventually give birth to one of history's most distinctive peoples. Around 1200 BC, as the late Bronze Age civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean began their precipitous decline, a different kind of transformation was taking place across the temperate forests and river valleys of Central Europe. Archaeological evidence from the Urnfield culture, spanning regions from the Upper Danube to the Rhine, reveals a society in transition. These communities, characterized by their practice of cremating the dead and placing ashes in ceramic urns within extensive burial fields, represent the earliest identifiable ancestors of what would become the Celtic peoples. The material culture of these settlements shows remarkable technological advancement. Bronzeworking had reached new heights of sophistication, with craftsmen producing elaborate swords, spearheads, and ornamental items that would become hallmarks of Celtic metalwork for centuries to come. The Urnfield peoples lived in substantial settlements, often positioned on elevated ground for defensive purposes. Their houses, rectangular structures with wooden frameworks and thatched roofs, could accommodate extended families and their livestock. Evidence from sites like Wasserburg-Buchau in southern Germany reveals communities of considerable complexity, with specialised craftsmen, extensive trade networks reaching as far as the Baltic for amber and the Mediterranean for luxury goods, and social hierarchies reflected in the varying quality of burial goods. Climate change played a crucial role in setting these peoples in motion. Around 1000 BC, temperatures across northern Europe began to drop, and precipitation patterns shifted dramatically. Archaeological evidence from bog cores and tree rings indicates that previously fertile regions became waterlogged and unsuitable for agriculture. Population pressure, combined with these environmental challenges, created the conditions for the great migrations that would reshape the ethnic landscape of Western Europe. The movement westward was neither sudden nor uniform. Instead, it unfolded over several centuries as successive waves of migrants, each carrying variations of the evolving Proto-Celtic culture pushed toward the Atlantic periphery. The Hallstatt culture, emerging around 800 BC, represents a crucial phase in this development. Named after the Austrian site where elaborate burial goods first revealed the wealth and sophistication of these communities, the Hallstatt peoples demonstrated the characteristic Celtic combination of martial prowess and artistic excellence. Hallstatt warriors carried long iron swords, a technological innovation that gave them significant advantages over Bronze Age populations. Their shields, reconstructed from archaeological finds, were large and oval, made of wood and leather with iron bosses. The warrior elite were buried with four-wheeled wagons, indicating both their mobility and their status within increasingly stratified societies. Women of high rank received equally elaborate burials, suggesting that Celtic society maintained more gender equality than many contemporary cultures. The linguistic evidence for this period remains necessarily fragmentary, but comparative analysis of later Celtic languages provides crucial insights into the development of what linguists term Proto-Celtic. This ancestral language, spoken across much of Central and Western Europe by 600 BC, contained the seeds of all later Celtic linguistic traditions. The process of linguistic differentiation began early, with geographical separation driving the evolution of distinct dialects. The Gaelic branch, which would eventually encompass Irish, Scottish Gaelic and Manx, began its divergence from continental Celtic languages around this time. Key phonological changes distinguished Gaelic from its Brythonic cousins. Most notably, Gaelic languages retained the original Indo-European KDW sound, which became P in Brythonic languages. This difference is clearly visible in cognate words. The Gaelic Seither corresponds to Brythonic Pedwa, both deriving from the same Proto-Celtic root. The Latin culture, flourishing from approximately 450 BC, marked the final phase of continental Celtic development before the expansion into the British Isles. Named after the Swiss site where distinctive metalwork was first identified, La Tène artistic style represented a revolutionary departure from earlier traditions. The flowing, curvilinear designs that characterised La Tène art would become one of the most recognisable features of Celtic culture, influencing artistic expression for millennia. La Tène warriors fought with long iron swords designed for slashing rather than thrusting, and their oval shields bore intricate decorative patterns. Archaeological evidence from sites like Gundestrup in Denmark, where a magnificent silver cauldron depicts Celtic warriors and deities, provides detailed information about their appearance and equipment. Warriors wore chainmail armour, an innovation that gave Celtic armies significant advantages in combat. Their helmets, often adorned with horns, wings, or animal figures, served both protective and psychological purposes. The expansion into Ireland, Scotland, and the Isle of Man occurred through multiple routes and over several centuries. The earliest Celtic settlers likely arrived in Ireland around 500 BC, though some evidence suggests earlier contact. These migrants encountered existing populations whose ancestors had inhabited the island since the Mesolithic period. The megalithic tomb builders, responsible for monuments like Newgrange and Carramore, had created sophisticated societies with their own religious traditions and technological capabilities. The interaction between incoming Celtic peoples and indigenous populations was complex and varied by region. In some areas, archaeological evidence suggests peaceful assimilation, with Celtic material culture gradually replacing earlier traditions. In others, there are signs of conflict and displacement. The process was neither uniform nor rapid. The transformation of Ireland into a recognisably Gaelic society took several centuries. Early Celtic settlements in Ireland followed patterns established on the continent. Ring forts, circular enclosures surrounded by earthen banks and wooden palisades, became the dominant settlement type. These structures, thousands of which still dot the Irish landscape, housed extended families and their livestock. The larger examples, such as the impressive stone fort of Dunankassa on the Aran Islands, demonstrate the defensive concerns of these early communities. Material culture from these early settlements reveals the gradual development of distinctly Irish Celtic traditions. Pottery styles evolved from continental prototypes but incorporated local innovations. Metalworking, particularly in bronze and iron, reached extraordinary levels of sophistication. The Broita gold collar, dating to the 1st century BC, exemplifies the technical mastery and artistic vision of Irish Celtic craftsmen. Burial practices provide crucial insights into the religious beliefs and social organisation of early Gaelic communities. The tradition of individual inhumation, often accompanied by weapons, jewellery and other grave goods, replaced earlier collective burial practices. High-status individuals were interred with elaborate assemblages that reflected their roles in life. Warriors received swords, spears and shields. Craftsmen were buried with their tools, and women of rank were accompanied by jewellery, mirrors and other personal items. The expansion into Scotland followed similar patterns but faced different challenges. The northern regions of Britain were inhabited by Pictish peoples who had developed their own sophisticated culture. The Celtic settlement of Scotland was concentrated initially in the western regions and the islands, where geographical barriers provided natural defensive positions. The kingdom of Dál Riata, established by Irish settlers in the 6th century AD, represents the culmination of this early expansion, though Celtic influence in Scotland had been growing for centuries before this formal political development. The Isle of Man, positioned strategically in the Irish Sea, became a crucial waypoint for Celtic expansion and cultural exchange. Its early Celtic inhabitants developed a distinct variant of Gaelic that would eventually become the Manx language. Archaeological evidence from sites like the Braid reveals settlements that combined Irish and Scottish influences while maintaining their own unique characteristics. The formation of distinct Gaelic cultural identities was a gradual process that extended well into the historical period. These early Celtic settlers brought with them not just languages and technologies, but entire worldviews that would reshape the cultural landscape of the Western British Isles. Their religious practices, centred on the worship of numerous deities associated with natural features and human activities, merged with and sometimes supplanted earlier traditions. The Druids, the learned class of Celtic society, played crucial roles in maintaining cultural continuity during this period of expansion and settlement. These individuals served as judges, teachers and religious leaders, preserving oral traditions that would eventually form the basis of medieval Irish and Scottish literature. Their training, which could last 20 years or more, ensured the transmission of laws, genealogies and mythological traditions across generations. Economic systems also underwent transformation as Celtic communities established themselves in their new territories. Agriculture remained the foundation of society, but the emphasis shifted toward cattle raising, which would become central to Gaelic culture. Cattle served not only as sources of food and materials, but as measures of wealth and status. The importance of cattle in early Gaelic society is reflected in legal texts, mythological narratives, and archaeological evidence from settlement sites. Trade networks connected these early Gaelic communities with the broader Celtic world and beyond. Archaeological finds include Roman coins, Mediterranean pottery, and amber from the Baltic, indicating that despite their peripheral location, these societies maintained contact with the distant regions. This trade was facilitated by skilled seafarers who developed sophisticated knowledge of Atlantic navigation, capabilities that would later enable extensive maritime expansion. By the 4th century BC, the Celtic communities that had established themselves across Ireland, western Scotland, and the Isle of Man had developed into complex societies that bore little resemblance to their migrant ancestors. The transformation from scattered settlements of continental Celtic peoples into sophisticated Gaelic kingdoms represented one of the most significant cultural developments in European prehistory. These societies had evolved intricate social hierarchies, religious systems, and economic networks that would define Gaelic civilization for the next millennium. The fundamental organising principle of early Gaelic society was the tuath, a territorial and kinship-based political unit that typically encompassed several hundred to a few thousand individuals. Each tuath controlled a specific territory, usually defined by natural boundaries such as rivers, mountains or forests. Archaeological evidence from ringfoot distributions across Ireland suggests that individual tuatha averaged between 150 and 300 square kilometres, though significant variation existed based on local geography and population density. The tuath represented more than mere administrative convenience. It embodied the intersection of kinship, territory and political authority that characterised Gaelic social organisation. Within each tuath, society was rigidly stratified into distinct classes, each with specific rights, obligations and legal status. At the apex stood the Ritwaita, the king of the tuath, whose authority derived from both hereditary right and the consent of the noble class. These kings were not absolute monarchs, but rather first among equals, bound by complex legal obligations and traditional constraints on their power. Archaeological evidence from high-status burials of this period reveals the material wealth associated with royal status: elaborate brooches, torques of twisted gold, imported wine amphorae, and weapons of exceptional craftsmanship. Below the king ranked the flaith, the noble class that provided the tuath's warrior elite and administrative leadership. These individuals owned substantial herds of cattle, controlled extensive territories, and maintained armed retinues of professional warriors. The archaeological record from sites like Rathcrogan in County Roscommon demonstrates the material culture associated with this class: large defensive enclosures, evidence of metalworking activities, and burial assemblages that included weapons, jewellery and imported luxury goods. The flaith were further subdivided into grades based on their wealth, measured primarily in cattle and their proximity to the royal lineage. The sealer or free farmers formed the backbone of tuath society. These individuals owned land and cattle, participated in the tuath's assembly, and bore arms in times of war. Archaeological evidence from smaller ring forts across the Irish landscape reveals their material conditions: substantial houses capable of accommodating extended families, evidence of mixed farming activities, and modest but well-made personal possessions. The Síle were legally free but bound to their social superiors through complex networks of obligation and clientship that regulated access to land, protection, and legal representation. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were the daoiseal or unfree farmers and various categories of slaves. The unfree possessed limited legal rights and were bound to the land they worked, though they were not chattel property in the classical sense. Slaves, often captured in raids or born into bondage, had no legal status and could be bought, sold, or killed at their owner's discretion. Archaeological evidence for these lower social strata is necessarily limited, but analysis of smaller, less defensible settlements suggests significant variation in living conditions based on social status. Kinship provided the organising framework within which these social hierarchies operated. Gaelic society was structured around patrilineal descent groups called fine, which traced their ancestry back 4 generations to a common male ancestor. The fine functioned as a corporate group with collective responsibility for the actions of its members, shared ownership of certain properties, and mutual obligations of support and protection. Members of a fine were collectively responsible for crimes committed by any individual member and shared in the compensation received for injuries inflicted upon the group. The Derb fine, or true family, consisted of all male descendants of a common great-grandfather and their dependents. This group controlled inheritance rights, elected leaders, and made collective decisions about marriage alliances and territorial disputes. Archaeological evidence from cemetery sites suggests that Derb fine groups maintained distinct burial areas, with elaborate grave goods reflecting the collective wealth and status of the kinship group. The system created networks of obligation and loyalty that extended far beyond the nuclear family, providing social stability in a world where central authority remained weak. Marriage practices reinforced these kinship networks while creating alliances between different fine and tuatha. Elite marriages were carefully negotiated political arrangements that involved substantial exchanges of cattle, land, and other wealth. Archaeological evidence from high-status female burials reveals the material culture associated with these alliances. Elaborate jewellery that may have served as dowry payments, imported goods that demonstrated the bride's family's wealth and connections, and personal items that reflected her status within her new household. The warrior elite occupied a special position within this social framework, serving as the military arm of the tuath and the primary means through which young nobles could achieve fame and advancement. These individuals underwent extensive training in weapons use, mounted combat, and the complex codes of honour that governed aristocratic behaviour. Archaeological finds from warrior graves reveal their equipment: long iron swords designed for slashing attacks, circular shields with elaborate bronze or iron bosses, and spears with leaf-shaped iron points. The quality of these weapons, often decorated with intricate lateen artistic motifs, demonstrates the high status accorded to military service. Warrior bands, known as fianna, operated semi-independently from the tuath structure, raiding neighbouring territories and serving as mercenaries in conflicts between rival kings. These groups consisted primarily of young, unmarried men from noble families who had not yet inherited land or established their own households. The fianna followed their own codes of conduct and lived outside normal social constraints, hunting in the wilderness during summer months, and seeking hospitality from tuath communities during winter. Archaeological evidence for fianna activities includes weapon caches hidden in remote locations and the remains of temporary camps in upland areas. Religious practices in Iron Age Gaelic society centred on the worship of numerous deities associated with specific natural features, human activities, and tribal identities. The Gaelic pantheon included gods and goddesses who controlled warfare, fertility, craftsmanship, and the boundaries between the human and supernatural worlds. Archaeological evidence from ritual sites across Ireland and Western Scotland reveals the material expressions of these beliefs. Votive deposits in lakes and bogs, elaborate ceremonial centres, and sacred groves where religious ceremonies took place. The Druids formed the intellectual and spiritual elite of Gaelic society, serving as priests, judges, teachers and advisors to kings. Their training, which could extend for 20 years or more, involved memorising vast quantities of oral tradition including laws, genealogies, religious formulas and mythological narratives. The Druids maintained no written records, believing that the act of writing would weaken memory and diminish the sacred power of their knowledge. Archaeological evidence for druidical activities is necessarily indirect, but ritual sites often contain evidence of human sacrifice, elaborate ceremonies, and the deposition of valuable objects as offerings to the gods. Sacred landscapes played crucial roles in Gaelic religious practice. Natural features such as springs, lakes, mountains, and forests were believed to be inhabited by supernatural beings and served as focal points for religious activities. The Hill of Tara in County Meath exemplifies the development of ceremonial centres that combined natural sanctity with human construction. Archaeological excavation has revealed multiple phases of activity spanning several centuries, including ritual burials, ceremonial structures, and evidence of large gatherings that may have involved multiple tuatha. Votive deposits in watery locations provide some of the most dramatic archaeological evidence for Gaelic religious practices. Lakes, rivers and bogs across Ireland and Scotland have yielded thousands of weapons, jewellery and other valuable objects that were deliberately deposited as offerings to the gods. The Lisnacroga Crannog in County Antrim produced a remarkable assemblage of Latena metalwork including swords, spears and decorative items that had been systematically deposited over several centuries. These finds demonstrate both the wealth of Gaelic communities and their willingness to sacrifice valuable possessions for religious purposes. The economic foundations of Iron Age Gaelic society rested primarily on cattle raising, which provided not only sustenance but also the primary measure of wealth and social status. Cattle served multiple functions. They provided milk, meat, leather, and bone for tools, while their ownership determined an individual's legal status and political influence. The legal texts that survive from later periods indicate that fines, compensation payments, and tribute obligations were all calculated in terms of cattle, with different grades of animals assigned specific values based on age, sex, and breeding potential. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites reveals the central importance of cattle in daily life. Ringforts typically included substantial enclosures for livestock, with evidence of cattle stalls, milking areas, and facilities for processing dairy products. Analysis of animal bones from middens indicates that cattle comprised between 60 and 80% of the livestock maintained by most communities, with sheep, goats, and pigs playing secondary roles. The seasonal movement of herds to upland pastures during summer months is evidenced by the remains of temporary shelters and enclosures in mountainous regions. Agriculture complemented pastoralism in the Gaelic economic system, with communities cultivating cereals, legumes and other crops in fields surrounding their settlements. Archaeological evidence indicates that early Gaelic farmers grew wheat, barley and oats, using iron ploughshares that represented significant technological advances over earlier bronze implements. The development of rotational farming systems, evidenced by field boundaries and soil analysis, allowed communities to maintain agricultural productivity while supporting substantial livestock herds. Metalworking reached extraordinary levels of sophistication in Iron Age Gaelic societies, with craftsmen producing weapons, tools and decorative objects that rivaled the finest work produced anywhere in the Celtic world. Archaeological evidence from workshop sites reveals the techniques employed: bloomery furnaces for smelting iron ore, specialised tools for working bronze and precious metals, and evidence of complex alloying processes that produced materials with specific properties for different applications. The Broita gold collar, discovered in County Londonderry, demonstrates the technical mastery achieved by Irish craftsmen with its intricate rapus decoration and sophisticated construction techniques. Trade networks connected Gaelic communities with the broader Atlantic world, facilitating the exchange of raw materials, finished goods, and luxury items. Archaeological finds include Roman coins, Mediterranean pottery, Baltic amber, and exotic materials that must have travelled vast distances to reach Irish and Scottish settlements. These trade relationships were maintained by skilled seafarers who developed sophisticated knowledge of Atlantic navigation, using curragh-type vessels that could handle the challenging conditions of the Irish Sea and western Scottish waters. Settlement patterns during this period reflected both defensive concerns and economic needs. Hill forts, constructed on elevated locations with commanding views of surrounding territories, served as strongholds for warrior elites and refugees for entire communities during times of conflict. The massive stone walls of Dun Angusa on Inishmore demonstrate the engineering capabilities of Iron Age builders, with their sophisticated construction techniques and strategic placement of defensive features. These fortifications required substantial labour investments and coordinated planning that could only have been accomplished by well-organised political authorities. Crannogs, artificial islands constructed in lakes and wetlands, represented another distinctive settlement type that combined defensive advantages with access to aquatic resources. Archaeological investigation of crannogs like those at Lochgower in County Sligo has revealed complex multi-phase construction involving timber frameworks, stone foundations, and sophisticated drainage systems. These settlements provided secure bases for communities while allowing access to fishing, waterfowl hunting, and the rich agricultural soils of lakeside environments. The development of proto-urban centres marked a significant evolution in Gaelic settlement patterns during the later Iron Age. Sites like Emain Macha in County Armagh demonstrate the emergence of large ceremonial and political centres that served multiple tuatha and attracted craftsmen, traders, and religious specialists. Archaeological excavation has revealed evidence of substantial timber structures, specialised craft activities, and ritual deposits that indicate the site's importance as both a political capital and religious centre. The sophisticated Gaelic societies that had emerged across Ireland and western Scotland by the 1st century BC would soon face their greatest external challenge since the original Celtic migrations. Rome's expanding influence across Gaul brought the Roman military machine into direct contact with Celtic peoples, and the intelligence networks that followed Roman legions began gathering information about the mysterious islands beyond the Channel. The encounters that followed would define the relationship between Gaelic civilization and the classical world for the next 4 centuries, establishing patterns of resistance, adaptation, and cultural exchange that would reshape both societies. Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul between 58 and 50 BC provided Rome with its first systematic intelligence about Celtic Britain and Ireland. Caesar's commentaries reveal a commander acutely aware of the strategic importance of understanding his enemy's broader networks and potential sources of reinforcement. During his siege of the Venetae in 56 BC, Caesar noted that these skilled Atlantic sailors maintained regular contact with communities across the Channel, carrying warriors, supplies, and intelligence between Gaul and Britain. The Venetae fleet, with its leather sails and iron anchor chains designed for Atlantic conditions, demonstrated the maritime capabilities that connected the Celtic world across vast distances. Caesar's own reconnaissance missions to Britain in 55 and 54 BC, though limited in scope and duration, provided crucial intelligence about the island's inhabitants, resources, and military capabilities. His accounts describe British warriors who fought from chariots, a practice that had disappeared from continental Celtic warfare generations earlier. These vehicles, drawn by small but hardy horses, carried a driver and a warrior who would leap down to fight on foot, while the chariot remained nearby for rapid retreat or repositioning. Archaeological evidence from sites like Lyn Cerrig Back in Anglesey has yielded chariot fittings and horse gear that confirms Caesar's descriptions of their construction and decoration. The intelligence Caesar gathered extended beyond military matters, to encompass the economic and social structures of British Celtic society. His reports noted the island's mineral wealth, particularly its tin deposits in Cornwall and silver mines in Wales, resources that would later attract sustained Roman attention. Caesar observed that British communities were more densely populated than their Gaulish counterparts, with extensive agricultural systems supporting large settlements. His accounts of British Druids travelling to Gaul for advanced training established the intellectual connections that linked Celtic communities across the Channel. More significantly for Gaelic history, Caesar's intelligence networks began gathering information about Ireland, which the Romans called Hibernia. Through interrogation of prisoners, merchants and refugees, Roman commanders learned of a large island to the west of Britain inhabited by fierce warriors who had never submitted to any foreign power. These early reports described Ireland's fragmented political structure, with numerous small kingdoms constantly engaged in cattle raids and territorial disputes. Roman geographers like Strabo would later compile this intelligence into more systematic accounts, describing Ireland as roughly half the size of Britain and inhabited by peoples even more savage than the Britons. The role of Gaelic mercenaries in continental Celtic resistance movements became increasingly significant as Roman pressure intensified across Gaul. Irish and Scottish warriors, renowned for their ferocity and skill with traditional Celtic weapons, served in the armies of Gaelic leaders like Vercingetorix during the Great Rebellion of 52 BC. Archaeological evidence from the Siege of Alesia includes weapons and personal ornaments that match styles found in Ireland and western Scotland, suggesting that warriors from these regions participated in the final desperate resistance to Roman conquest. These mercenary relationships operated through established networks of kinship and alliance that connected Gaelic communities with their continental cousins. Warriors from prominent Irish families would spend years serving in Gaelic armies, gaining experience in large-scale warfare while earning wealth and reputation that enhanced their status upon returning home. The practice created a flow of military intelligence, tactical innovations, and strategic awareness that kept Gaelic leaders informed about Roman capabilities and intentions long before direct contact occurred. The defeat of continental Celtic resistance had profound implications for Gaelic societies. Thousands of refugees fled across the Channel to Britain and Ireland, bringing with them detailed knowledge of Roman military tactics, administrative systems, and cultural practices. These refugees included not only warriors and their families, but also craftsmen, druids, and merchants whose skills and knowledge enriched their host communities. Archaeological evidence from Irish sites dating to the 1st century AD shows sudden increases in the quality and quantity of metalwork, suggesting that refugee craftsmen brought advanced techniques and possibly new tools to Irish workshops. The Roman conquest of Britain, beginning with Claudius's invasion in 43 AD, brought Roman power to the borders of Gaelic territory. The subjugation of southern and central Britain proceeded systematically, with Roman legions establishing fortified positions and administrative centres that gradually extended Roman control northward. By 78 AD, Roman forces under Agricola had reached the borders of Caledonia, the region that would later become Scotland, where they encountered fierce resistance from peoples the Romans called Caledoni. The Caledoni represented a confederation of tribes inhabiting the Scottish Highlands, peoples whose culture and language were closely related to the Gaelic communities of Ireland and western Scotland. Archaeological evidence from sites like Burnswook Hill reveals the sophistication of Caledonian defensive systems, with massive hill forts protected by multiple ramparts and chevaux de frise, fields of pointed stones designed to break up cavalry charges. These fortifications required enormous labour investments and demonstrated the ability of Caledonian leaders to coordinate large-scale construction projects across tribal boundaries. Agricola's campaigns against the Caledonii between 79 and 84 AD represented Rome's most serious attempt to extend its authority over Gaelic-speaking peoples. The Roman governor employed the systematic approach that had proven successful in southern Britain, establishing forward bases, cutting off enemy supply lines, and forcing decisive battles where Roman discipline and equipment advantages could be brought to bear. Archaeological excavation at Roman marching camps across Scotland traces the roots of Agricola's advances, revealing the methodical nature of Roman military operations. The climactic engagement occurred at Mons Graupius in 83 or 84 AD, where Agricola's forces met a Caledonian army led by a chieftain named Calgacus. Tacitus, Agricola's son-in-law and biographer, provides the only detailed account of this battle, describing how the Caledonians initially held the advantage of terrain and numbers. The Caledonian army, estimated at 30,000 warriors, occupied the slopes of an unidentified mountain, probably somewhere in the Grampian range. Their battle line extended across the hillside, with chariots and cavalry on the flanks and masses of foot warriors in the centre. The Caledonian warriors wore minimal armour, relying on large oval shields and long slashing swords for protection and offence. Many carried small round shields called targes and fought with spears designed for both thrusting and throwing. Their appearance was calculated to intimidate. Warriors painted their bodies with blue woad, wore their hair long and often lime-washed to create spiky crests, and adorned themselves with gold torques and arm rings that proclaimed their status and achievements. The sound of their war horns, long bronze instruments called carnix that produced haunting wails, filled the air as they prepared for battle. Agricola deployed his forces with characteristic Roman precision. Auxiliary troops, many of them Britons recently incorporated into the Roman army, formed the front line, while the legions remained in reserve. Roman artillery engines called ballistae were positioned to sweep the Caledonian flanks, and cavalry units prepared to exploit any breakthrough. The battle began with exchanges of missiles, javelins, arrows, and sling stones, before developing into close combat as the lines collided. The turning point came when Roman cavalry, having worked around the Caledonian flanks, attacked the enemy rear. The Caledonian battle line, already under pressure from the disciplined advance of Roman auxiliaries, began to fragment as warriors found themselves surrounded. Tacitus claims that 10,000 Caledonians died in the battle, while Roman losses numbered only 360 men. While these figures likely reflect Roman propaganda, archaeological evidence from the period suggests that Mons Graupius was indeed a devastating defeat for Caledonian resistance. Despite this victory, Agricola's conquest proved temporary. Political changes in Rome led to his recall, and the legions were gradually withdrawn to deal with threats elsewhere in the empire. The Caledoni and their allies, though blooded, had not been permanently subdued. Within a generation, they had rebuilt their military capabilities and resumed raiding Roman territories in southern Scotland. The pattern of Roman advance followed by withdrawal would characterise the relationship between Rome and the northern peoples for the next 3 centuries. The construction of Hadrian's Wall between 122 and 128 AD marked Rome's acknowledgement that the conquest of Caledonia was neither feasible nor cost-effective. This massive fortification, stretching 73 miles from Wallsend on the River Tyne to Bonus on Solway, represented one of the most ambitious engineering projects in Roman history. The wall itself stood approximately 15 feet high and was topped with a parapet and walkway that brought its total height to nearly 20 feet. 16 major forts along its length housed garrison troops, while smaller mile castles and turrets provided observation points and sally ports for patrols. The wall's construction required enormous resources, an estimated 15,000 tons of stone, hundreds of thousands of tons of earth for foundations and ramparts, and years of labour by legionary engineers and auxiliary troops. The eastern sections were built of dressed stone with a rubble core, while western portions were initially constructed of turf and timber before being rebuilt in stone. The engineering challenges were immense, particularly where the wall crossed rivers and traversed the rocky crags of the Windsill escarpment. Archaeological evidence reveals the sophisticated nature of the wall's defensive systems. The vallum, a mysterious earthwork consisting of a central ditch flanked by 2 mounds, ran parallel to the wall for most of its length. This feature may have served as military boundary, controlling access to the wall zone and preventing unauthorised movement between Roman territory and the unconquered north. The discovery of writing tablets at Vindolanda, one of the wall's forts, provides intimate details of garrison life and reveals the constant vigilance required to maintain the frontier. The Antonine Wall, built around 142 AD during a brief Roman re-advance into Scotland, demonstrated the temporary nature of Roman gains in Caledonian territory. This turf and timber fortification stretched 37 miles between the Forth and Clyde estuaries, establishing a new frontier approximately 100 miles north of Hadrian's Wall. Archaeological investigation has revealed 19 forts along its length, connected by a military road and supported by a series of fortlets and signal stations. The Antonine Wall's construction involved different challenges from its stone predecessor. Built primarily of turf blocks laid on a stone foundation, the wall stood approximately 12 feet high and was fronted by a substantial ditch. The engineering required careful attention to drainage and foundation stability in the often waterlogged Scottish lowlands. Evidence from excavations at forts like Rough Castle reveals the daily lives of garrison troops who maintained this exposed frontier. The abandonment of the Antonine Wall around 162 AD, after only 20 years of occupation, marked the end of sustained Roman attempts to conquer Caledonia. The withdrawal was probably precipitated by renewed Caledonian resistance and the need for troops elsewhere in the empire. Archaeological evidence suggests that the retreat was conducted in good order, with valuable equipment removed and installations deliberately demolished to prevent their use by enemies. The peoples who successfully resisted Roman expansion included not only the Caledonia, but also the mysterious Picts, whose relationship to Gaelic-speaking populations remains a subject of scholarly debate. Pictish territory extended across much of northern and eastern Scotland, encompassing regions where distinctive symbol stones and archaeological remains attest to a sophisticated culture with its own artistic traditions and political organisation. The Pictish language appears to have been Celtic, possibly related to Brythonic rather than Gaelic, though the evidence remains fragmentary and controversial. Pictish military capabilities clearly impressed Roman commanders, who described them as formidable opponents skilled in guerrilla warfare and capable of coordinating large-scale operations across tribal boundaries. Their use of painted body decoration gave them their Roman name Picti, meaning painted people, though they called themselves something else entirely. Archaeological evidence from Pictish hill forts reveals sophisticated defensive systems and evidence of metalworking capabilities that produced weapons and ornaments of high quality. The relationship between Picts and Gaels was complex, involving both conflict and cooperation depending on circumstances. In some periods, they united against Roman threats. In others, they fought each other for territory and resources. The gradual Gaelic settlement of western Scotland, particularly through the establishment of the kingdom of Dál Riata in the 6th century AD, would eventually lead to the political unification of Pictish and Gaelic territories, but during the Roman period, they remained distinct peoples with separate identities and interests. Ireland's position as the only major Celtic region to remain completely unconquered by Rome was both a source of strength and a burden for Gaelic civilization. The island served as a refuge for Celtic culture, preserving traditions, languages, and social systems that disappeared elsewhere under Roman influence. Irish monasteries would later become centres for the preservation of classical learning during the early medieval period. But during the Roman centuries, Ireland remained largely isolated from the intellectual and technological developments occurring in Romanised Britain and Gaul. Roman knowledge of Ireland remained limited throughout the imperial period, based primarily on second-hand accounts from traders, refugees, and the occasional diplomatic contact. Tacitus claimed that Agricola had considered invading Ireland, believing it could be conquered and held by a single legion. But this assessment likely reflected Roman ignorance of Irish geography and military capabilities, rather than realistic strategic planning. The logistical challenges of mounting a successful invasion across the Irish Sea, combined with the fierce resistance Roman forces had encountered from Celtic peoples elsewhere, made such an enterprise extremely risky. Archaeological evidence suggests that Roman material culture did reach Ireland through trade and diplomatic exchange, even without direct conquest. Roman coins, pottery and metalwork appear at Irish sites, particularly in the eastern regions closest to Roman Britain. Some Irish kings may have sought Roman recognition or support in their conflicts with rivals, following patterns established elsewhere in the Celtic world. However, these contacts remained limited and did not result in the systematic Romanisation that transformed Celtic societies in Gaul and southern Britain. The absence of Roman conquest allowed Irish Gaelic society to continue developing along traditional lines, maintaining the Tuath system, druidical traditions, and warrior culture that had emerged during the Iron Age. This continuity would prove crucial for the preservation of Celtic legal systems, mythological traditions, and artistic styles that would later influence medieval European culture. The great Irish legal texts, the Brecon Laws, preserve social and legal concepts that had disappeared from Romanised Celtic territories, providing modern scholars with invaluable insights into pre-Roman Celtic civilization. The withdrawal of Roman legions from Britain in 410 AD created a power vacuum that would fundamentally transform the relationship between Gaelic and Romano-British societies. As imperial administration collapsed and Germanic tribes established kingdoms across former Roman territories, Ireland emerged from its centuries of relative isolation to become an unexpected centre of Christian learning and missionary activity. The transformation of Gaelic society from a collection of warrior kingdoms practicing traditional Celtic religions to the most Christianised region in Western Europe represents one of the most remarkable cultural revolutions in medieval history. The process of Christianisation in Gaelic lands began not with dramatic conversion events but through gradual contact with Christian communities in Roman Britain and Gaul. Archaeological evidence from 5th century Irish sites reveals increasing quantities of Mediterranean pottery, suggesting trade relationships that likely facilitated the spread of Christian ideas alongside material goods. Christian symbols begin appearing on Irish metalwork during this period, often incorporated into traditional Latin and artistic motifs, in ways that suggest syncretistic religious practices rather than complete abandonment of older beliefs. The arrival of Patricius, known to history as St. Patrick, around 432 AD marked a crucial acceleration in the Christianization process. Though the historical Patrick bears little resemblance to the legendary figure of later hagiography. Born into a Romano-British Christian family, probably in Western Britain or Wales, Patrick experienced slavery in Ireland as a young man before escaping and receiving religious training in Gaul. His own writings, the Confessio and the Letter to Croticus, provide rare contemporary testimony about the challenges facing Christian missionaries in 5th century Ireland. Patrick's mission strategy focused on converting kings and noble families, understanding that Christianity would spread most effectively through existing social hierarchies, rather than popular movements among the lower classes. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with early Christian activity, such as the Royal Centre at Cashel in County Tipperary, reveals the construction of churches within or adjacent to traditional royal enclosures. These locations demonstrate how Christian missionaries adapted their approach to existing power structures, establishing churches under royal patronage rather than challenging established political authorities. The conversion process was neither uniform nor complete during Patrick's lifetime. Traditional Irish religious practices, centred on druids and the worship of natural deities, continued alongside Christian observances in many regions. Archaeological excavation at ritual sites like the Hill of Tara reveals evidence of continued pagan ceremonies well into the 6th century, with Christian symbols gradually being incorporated into traditional religious contexts. This syncretism is particularly evident in early Christian art, where Celtic spirals and interlaced patterns merge with Christian iconography to create distinctive hybrid forms. The establishment of monastic communities represented the most significant institutional innovation of early Irish Christianity. Unlike the episcopal structure that dominated Christian organisation in Roman territories, Irish Christianity developed around monasteries founded by charismatic holy men who attracted followers through their reputation for sanctity and learning. These communities, known as parousia, often controlled extensive territories and exercised both spiritual and temporal authority over surrounding populations. Clonmacnoise, founded by St Ciaran around 544 AD on the banks of the River Shannon, exemplifies the development of major Irish monastic centres. Archaeological investigation has revealed the evolution of the site from a simple hermitage to a complex of churches, workshops and residential buildings that housed hundreds of monks and lay workers. The monastery's strategic location at the intersection of major river and land routes made it a natural centre for trade and communication, while its workshops produced manuscripts, metalwork and other goods that were distributed across Ireland and beyond. The monastic rule that governed these communities adapted Mediterranean traditions to Irish conditions and cultural expectations. The Rule of Columbanus, written in the late 6th century, reveals the austere discipline expected of Irish monks: minimal food and sleep, constant prayer and manual labour, and complete obedience to abbatial authority. However, Irish monasticism also incorporated elements of traditional Gaelic culture, including the importance of kinship networks in monastic recruitment and the role of learned classes in preserving cultural traditions. St Columba's foundation of Iona, around 563 AD, established the most influential centre of Gaelic Christianity in Scotland. Born into the powerful Uí Níl dynasty of Donegal, Columba brought both royal connections and extensive learning to his Scottish mission. Iona's location in the Inner Hebrides positioned it perfectly to serve as a bridge between Irish and Pictish territories, facilitating the gradual conversion of Pictish kingdoms to Christianity, while maintaining connections with Irish monastic networks. The monastery on Iona developed into a major centre of manuscript production, metalworking and stone carving. Archaeological excavation has revealed evidence of sophisticated workshops where monks produced illuminated manuscripts, carved stone crosses, and created metalwork of exceptional quality. The Iona scriptorium became renowned throughout Western Europe for the beauty and accuracy of its biblical texts, with manuscripts from Iona reaching monasteries in Ireland, England, and continental Europe. Columba's mission to the Picts involved complex negotiations with existing political and religious authorities. The Pictish king Bride mac Maelchon, who ruled from his fortress at Craig Padrig near modern Inverness, initially received Columba with suspicion, but eventually granted him permission to preach within Pictish territories. Archaeological evidence from Pictish sites of this period reveals the gradual adoption of Christian symbols alongside traditional Pictish motifs, suggesting a process of cultural accommodation rather than wholesale replacement of existing beliefs. The conversion of Pictish kingdoms proceeded slowly, with Christian communities initially concentrated around royal centres and major trade routes. The distinctive Pictish symbol stones of this period often combine traditional symbols with Christian crosses, creating unique artistic expressions that reflect the complex process of religious transformation. Sites like the Pictish monastery at Portmahomac in Easter Ross reveal the establishment of major Christian centres that served both spiritual and economic functions within Pictish society. The Golden Age of Irish monasticism reached its zenith during the 7th and 8th centuries, when Irish monasteries became the most important centres of learning in Western Europe. The collapse of classical education in former Roman territories, combined with the isolation of Byzantine scholarship, create conditions where Irish monasteries preserved and transmitted much of the intellectual heritage of the ancient world. The library at Clonmacnoise contained not only Christian texts, but also classical works of philosophy, history and literature that had been lost elsewhere in Western Europe. Irish monks developed distinctive approaches to manuscript production that combined traditional Celtic artistic motifs with Christian iconography to create some of the most beautiful books ever produced. The Book of Durrow, created around 675 AD, demonstrates the sophisticated artistic techniques developed in Irish scriptoria. Its pages combine intricate geometric patterns derived from traditional metalwork designs with stylized animal forms and elaborate initial letters that transform text into visual art. The vellum pages were prepared using techniques that produced writing surfaces of exceptional quality, while the inks were created from local materials using formulas that preserved their colours for over a millennium. The Book of Kells, probably produced at Iona in the late 8th century, represents the pinnacle of Irish manuscript art. Each page demonstrates the extraordinary skill of Irish scribes and illuminators, who created complex geometric patterns, stylized human and animal figures, and elaborate decorative borders that transform the biblical text into a work of supreme artistic achievement. The technical challenges involved in creating such work were immense. The preparation of hundreds of vellum pages from carefully selected calf skins, the creation of permanent inks from minerals and organic materials, and the coordination of multiple scribes and artists working over several years. The development of distinctive Irish script forms facilitated the production and distribution of texts throughout the Gaelic world. Irish scribes developed several distinctive hands, including the formal majuscule used for biblical texts and the more cursive minuscule employed for everyday documents. These scripts were specifically adapted to the Irish language, incorporating special characters for sounds that did not exist in Latin. The spread of Irish script forms to continental European monasteries established Irish influence over manuscript production across much of medieval Europe. Irish monastic schools attracted students from across Western Europe, earning Ireland the designation Island of Saints and Scholars. The curriculum at major Irish monasteries included not only Christian theology but also classical literature, mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy. Irish scholars developed innovative approaches to education that emphasised critical thinking and textual analysis, producing graduates who became influential teachers and administrators throughout medieval Europe. The reputation of Irish learning was such that kings and nobles from England, Gaul and Germany sent their sons to be educated in Irish monasteries. The preservation of classical learning in Irish monasteries occurred through systematic copying and commentary projects that maintained texts that had been lost elsewhere. Irish scholars created extensive commentaries on classical authors, preserving not only the original texts but also sophisticated analyses of their meaning and significance. The Irish commentary tradition on Virgil, for example, preserves interpretations and textual variants that provide crucial insights into how classical literature was understood in the early medieval period. The development of distinctive Gaelic Christian art forms represented a remarkable synthesis of traditional Celtic artistic traditions with Christian iconography and Mediterranean influences. Irish metal workers created ecclesiastical objects of extraordinary beauty and technical sophistication, including chalices, reliquaries and book covers that combine traditional techniques with Christian symbolism. The Ardagh chalice, discovered in County Limerick and dating to the 8th century, demonstrates the technical mastery achieved by Irish craftsmen. Its silver bowl, decorated with intricate gold filigree work and coloured glass studs, required sophisticated metallurgical knowledge and artistic vision. High crosses, the massive stone monuments that began appearing at Irish monasteries during the 8th century, represent perhaps the most distinctive contribution of Irish Christianity to medieval art. These monuments, some standing over 20 feet high, were carved from single blocks of sandstone and decorated with complex programs of biblical scenes, geometric patterns and inscriptions. The Cross of Muireadach at Monaster Boyce, erected in the early 10th century, displays the sophisticated iconographic programs developed by Irish sculptors. Its panels depict scenes from both the Old and New Testaments, arranged in complex theological relationships that demonstrate the advanced biblical scholarship of Irish monasteries. The technical challenges involved in creating high crosses were considerable. Quarrying and transporting blocks of stone weighing several tons required sophisticated engineering and substantial labour forces. The carving itself demanded not only artistic skill but also deep knowledge of Christian iconography and biblical narrative. The durability of these monuments, many of which remain substantially intact after more than a millennium, testifies to the technical competence of Irish stone carvers. The expansion of Irish missionary activity to continental Europe during the 6th and 7th centuries established the Hiberno-Scottish mission as one of the most significant cultural movements of the early medieval period. Irish monks, motivated by the concept of peregrinatio pro Christo, established monasteries and churches across Gaul, Germany, Switzerland and northern Italy. These foundations serve not only as centres of Christian worship but also as conduits for the transmission of Irish learning and artistic traditions to continental European culture. St Columbanus, who left Ireland around 590 AD, established the most influential Irish monastic foundations on the continent. His monasteries at Annagray, Luxeuil and Fontaine in Gaul attracted hundreds of followers and became major centres of religious and intellectual life. The rule of Columbanus, which governed these communities, was more austere than the Benedictine rule that dominated continental monasticism, requiring extensive fasting, prolonged prayer, and severe penances for infractions. This rigour attracted many continental Europeans who sought more demanding forms of religious life than were available in existing monasteries. The monastery at Luxeuil became a major centre of manuscript production, with its scriptorium producing texts that were distributed throughout medieval Europe. Irish scribes at Luxeuil developed hybrid script forms that combined Irish and continental traditions, creating new standards for manuscript production that influenced scriptoria across Gaul and Germany. The monastery's library contained both Irish texts and continental works, facilitating intellectual exchange between different scholarly traditions. St Gall, a companion of Columbanus, established the monastery that would become one of medieval Europe's most important libraries. Located in what is now Switzerland, St Gallen developed into a major centre of learning that preserved thousands of manuscripts from the early medieval period. The monastery's Irish origins are evident in its distinctive architectural features, manuscript collection, and educational practices, which maintained Irish traditions while adapting to continental conditions. The Irish monastery at Bobbio in northern Italy, founded by Columbanus in 612 AD, became a crucial link between Irish scholarship and the intellectual traditions of the Mediterranean world. Bobbio's library contained Greek texts that were rare in Western Europe, along with Irish manuscripts and continental works. Irish scholars at Bobbio created important commentaries on classical authors and contributed to the preservation of texts that would otherwise have been lost during the upheavals of the early medieval period. The cultural exchange facilitated by Irish missionaries operated in both directions, with continental influences reaching Ireland through returning monks and imported manuscripts. Irish monasteries acquired Greek and Latin texts from continental libraries, while continental scholars travelled to Ireland to study in Irish schools. This exchange enriched both traditions, creating a cosmopolitan intellectual culture that transcended regional boundaries. The impact of Irish missionaries extended beyond purely religious activities to encompass education, agriculture and technology transfer. Irish monks introduced new agricultural techniques to continental communities, including advanced methods of land reclamation and crop rotation that increased agricultural productivity. They also transmitted technological innovations, particularly in manuscript production and metalworking, that influenced continental European craftsmanship for centuries. The diplomatic relationships established through Irish missionary activity created networks of communication and cultural exchange that connected Ireland with the major political centres of medieval Europe. Irish monasteries served as neutral ground where representatives of different kingdoms could meet and negotiate, while Irish scholars served as advisors to continental rulers who valued their learning and supposed impartiality in local political disputes. The tranquil morning of June 15, 795 AD, shattered the centuries-old peace of Rathlin Island, when dragon-prowed longships appeared on the horizon off the Antrim coast. The island's monastery, perched on limestone cliffs overlooking the turbulent waters between Ireland and Scotland, had served as a beacon of Gaelic Christian learning for over 2 centuries. Its scriptorium housed precious manuscripts, its workshops produced exquisite metalwork, and its treasury contained generations of accumulated wealth donated by pious kings and nobles. The Viking raiders who beached their shallow-drafted vessels on the island's rocky shores understood none of this cultural significance, but they recognised the glint of gold and silver that adorned the monastery's altars and reliquaries. The attack on Rathlin represented the first recorded Viking raid on Irish territory, marking the beginning of a period that would fundamentally transform Gaelic society. The raiders, likely originating from the fjords of western Norway, had perfected their maritime technology during generations of coastal raiding in the North Sea and Atlantic approaches. Their longships, constructed with overlapping oak planks secured by iron rivets, could navigate both open seas and shallow rivers with equal facility. The largest vessels stretched over 90 feet in length and could carry crews of 60 to 80 warriors, while smaller boats accommodated raiding parties of 20 to 30 men. The Vikings who descended upon Rathlin wore distinctive battle gear that reflected both their martial culture and their growing wealth from successful raids. Iron helmets, often reinforced with bronze strips and featuring protective nose guards, covered heads that bore the long braided hair characteristic of Scandinavian warriors. Their round shields, constructed from limewood planks bound with iron rims, displayed painted designs that identified individual warriors and their regional origins. Double-edged swords with pattern-welded blades hung from leather baldricks, while long-hafted axes served as both weapons and tools for breaking down monastery doors and prying apart stone walls in search of hidden treasures. The monastery's defenders, primarily Irish monks with limited military training, could offer little resistance against seasoned Viking warriors. The raiders systematically looted the church buildings, seizing chalices, book covers, reliquaries, and any other objects containing precious metals. Manuscripts were scattered and trampled, their vellum pages valued only for the gold leaf that decorated their illuminated initials. The human cost was equally devastating. Monks who resisted were killed outright, while others were taken as slaves to be sold in Scandinavian markets, or ransomed back to their communities. The success of the Rathlin raid encouraged further Viking expeditions to Irish waters. Archaeological evidence from Norwegian burial sites of this period reveals Irish ecclesiastical objects that can only have been acquired through raiding activities. The Hohen Hoard, discovered in Buskerud County, contained Irish bronze bowls, enamel-decorated brooches, and fragments of manuscript covers that had been melted down for their precious metal content. These finds demonstrate not only the extent of Viking raiding, but also the systematic nature of their approach to extracting wealth from Irish monasteries. The pattern established at Rathlin was repeated across Ireland's coastline throughout the late 8th and early 9th centuries. Inishmurray, off the Sligo coast, suffered devastating attacks that left its round tower scarred with burn marks still visible today. The monastery at Skellig Michael, perched on its seemingly impregnable rocky outcrop in the Atlantic, proved vulnerable to Viking seamanship and determination. Even inland sites like Clonmacnoise, protected by miles of bogland and the broad Shannon, fell victim to raiders who had learned to navigate Ireland's river systems with their shallow-drafted vessels. The initial Viking raids targeted monasteries not merely because they contained portable wealth, but because they represented the most vulnerable concentrations of valuable goods in early medieval Ireland. Gaelic society's decentralised political structure meant that secular wealth remained dispersed among numerous royal centres, each protected by warrior bands and defensive fortifications. Monasteries, by contrast, had accumulated centuries of donations while maintaining minimal military defences, making them attractive targets for raiders seeking maximum profit with minimal risk. The psychological impact of these early raids extended far beyond their immediate material damage. Irish chronicles of the period describe the Vikings as divine punishment for the sins of the faithful, while others interpreted the attacks as signs of approaching apocalypse. The Annals of Ulster record that after the raid on Rathlin, the heathens came to Ireland for the first time. establishing a narrative framework that would influence Irish perceptions of Viking activities for generations. This religious interpretation of Viking raids as supernatural punishment encouraged some Irish communities to view resistance as futile, potentially facilitating subsequent attacks. However, the initial shock of Viking raids gradually gave way to more pragmatic responses as Gaelic communities adapted to the new threat. Irish kings began fortifying monasteries within their territories, constructing the distinctive round towers that still dominate the Irish landscape. These structures, rising up to 120 feet in height, with their entrances positioned well above ground level, served as both watchtowers and refuges during attacks. The tower at Glendalough, built in response to repeated Viking raids, exemplifies the architectural solutions developed by Irish communities. Its conical stone cap could accommodate signal fires visible for miles, while its internal chambers provided secure storage for precious objects and manuscripts. The construction of round towers required sophisticated engineering knowledge and substantial labour investments that could only be mobilised by wealthy monastic communities with royal support. The towers at Clonmacnoise and Monasterboice demonstrate the advanced masonry techniques employed by Irish builders. Their walls, constructed from carefully dressed sandstone blocks, tapered from foundations over 4 feet thick to tops barely 2 feet wide. Internal wooden floors supported by stone corbels divided the towers into multiple levels connected by narrow spiral staircases carved into the wall thickness. The defensive measures adopted by Irish monasteries extended beyond architectural innovations to include the development of early warning networks that connected vulnerable communities across wide geographical areas. Beacon systems, utilising hilltop signal fires, could transmit warnings of approaching Viking fleets across entire regions within hours of their first sighting. The Hill of Howth, commanding Dublin Bay, became a crucial observation point where Irish watchers could detect Viking ships while they were still hours away from potential targets along the coast. Irish metalworkers responded to the Viking threat by developing new techniques for concealing valuable objects. The practice of burying ecclesiastical treasures in remote locations became widespread, creating the hoards that modern archaeologists continue to discover across Ireland. The Derrinaflan hoard, buried sometime in the 9th century near a monastery in County Tipperary, contained a silver chalice, paten, and strainer of exceptional quality that had been carefully wrapped and hidden in a bog. Similar hoards from sites like Ardagh and Moyle demonstrate the systematic efforts made by Irish communities to protect their most precious possessions from Viking raiders. The evolution of Viking activities in Ireland from seasonal raiding to permanent settlement represented a fundamental shift that would reshape the island's political and economic landscape. The establishment of the first Viking winter camps, known as Long Puert, marked the transition from hit-and-run attacks to sustained occupation of Irish territory. These fortified bases, constructed at strategic locations along major rivers and harbours, provided secure anchorages for Viking fleets while serving as centres for more extensive raiding operations. The Longport established at Dublin around 841 AD became the most significant Viking settlement in Ireland, evolving from a temporary winter camp into a major urban centre that would dominate Irish sea trade for centuries. Archaeological excavation in modern Dublin has revealed the extensive timber fortifications that protected the early Viking settlement. The defences consisted of earthen ramparts topped with wooden palisades, fronted by deep ditches that could be flooded from the nearby River Liffey. Within these fortifications, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of workshops, residential areas, and warehouses that demonstrate the rapid development of Dublin as a commercial centre. The location chosen for Dublin reflected sophisticated understanding of Irish geography and trade patterns. Positioned at the mouth of the Liffey, where it provided access to the rich agricultural lands of the Eastern Midlands, Dublin also commanded the narrow sea passage between Ireland and Wales. Viking ships based at Dublin could intercept merchant vessels travelling between Irish ports and continental markets, while also launching raids against targets throughout the Irish Sea region. The The settlement's position on a ford across the Liffey, marked by the Irish name Bailey Atha Cliath, had been recognised as strategically important long before the Vikings arrived. The establishment of Viking settlements at Cork and Waterford followed similar patterns, with raiders selecting locations that combined defensive advantages with commercial opportunities. Cork's position at the head of a long sea inlet provided protection from Atlantic storms while offering access to the fertile valleys of Munster. The Vikings constructed their settlement on an island in the River Lee, surrounded by marshlands that provided natural defences against Irish attacks. Archaeological evidence from Cork reveals extensive evidence of metalworking, leather production, and other crafts that supplied both local needs and export markets. Waterford's location near the confluence of the rivers Suir, Nore and Barrow made it a natural centre for trade with the Irish interior. Viking merchants based at Waterford could navigate far inland, reaching Irish communities that had previously been isolated from international commerce. The settlement's workshops produced goods specifically designed for Irish markets, including jewellery that combined Scandinavian techniques with Celtic artistic motifs. This cultural synthesis reflected the complex relationships that developed between Viking settlers and Irish populations, as initial hostility gave way to more nuanced interactions. The transformation of the Scottish Hebrides into a major centre of Viking settlement occurred through different processes than those observed in Ireland. The island's scattered populations and limited political organisation made systematic resistance difficult, while their strategic position along Atlantic shipping routes made them attractive to Viking navigators. Archaeological evidence from sites like the Udall on North Uist reveals the gradual replacement of Gaelic material culture with Scandinavian artefacts, suggesting either population replacement or rapid cultural assimilation. The Viking settlement of the Hebrides created a distinctive Norse Gaelic culture that would dominate the western Scottish islands for centuries. This hybrid society combined Scandinavian maritime traditions with Gaelic social structures, creating communities that were equally comfortable raiding Irish monasteries and negotiating with Scottish kings. The archaeological record from sites like Jarlshof in Shetland demonstrates the evolution of this culture through successive phases of occupation. Early levels contain purely Scandinavian artefacts, oval brooches, combs, and weapons typical of Norwegian settlements. Later phases show increasing evidence of cultural mixing, with Gaelic-style metalwork appearing alongside Scandinavian pottery and tools. The development of distinctive Norse Gaelic artistic styles reflected the complex cultural negotiations occurring in Viking settlements across the Irish Sea region. Metalworkers in Dublin and the Hebrides created jewellery that combined traditional Scandinavian animal motifs with Celtic interlace patterns, producing objects that appeal to both cultural traditions. The Kilmainham brooch, discovered in Dublin and dating to the 9th century, exemplifies this synthesis. Its silver surface bears intricate animal designs executed in the Scandinavian Bora style, while its overall form and construction techniques derive from Irish tradition. The emergence of powerful Irish kings capable of organising effective resistance to Viking expansion marked a crucial turning point in the relationship between Gaelic and Scandinavian populations. The rise of Brian Boru, who would eventually become High King of Ireland, demonstrated the potential for Irish military adaptation to meet the Viking challenge. Brian's early career, spent fighting Viking raiders in his native Munster, provided him with intimate knowledge of Scandinavian tactics and weaknesses that would prove crucial in his later campaigns. Brian's military innovations reflected careful study of Viking warfare, combined with creative adaptation of traditional Irish tactics. He recognised that the mobility provided by Viking ships could be countered by rapid movement of Irish forces along interior routes, allowing defenders to concentrate superior numbers against divided raiding parties. His forces developed new techniques for attacking Viking settlements, including the use of fire ships to destroy anchored fleets and coordinated land-sea assaults that prevented Viking forces from retreating to their vessels. The political consolidation that Brian achieved in Munster during the late 10th century demonstrated the potential for Irish adaptation to Viking challenges. By uniting previously fractious kingdoms under his authority, Brian created military resources capable of matching Viking forces in sustained campaigns. His control over the Shannon estuary allowed him to regulate Viking access to Ireland's interior, while his alliance with the Church provided both moral authority and access to the wealth needed to maintain professional military forces. The complex relationships that developed between Irish kings and Viking settlers defied simple categorization as either hostile or cooperative. Many Irish rulers found Viking warriors useful as mercenaries in their conflicts with rival kingdoms, while Viking leaders sought Irish allies to legitimize their territorial claims. The political situation became further complicated by the emergence of second-generation Viking leaders who had been born in Ireland and maintained complex loyalties to both Scandinavian and Irish traditions. The Battle of Clontarf on April 23, 1014, represented the culmination of these complex political relationships, rather than a simple conflict between Irish and Viking forces. Brian Boru's army included Viking allies from Limerick and other settlements, while his opponents included Irish kingdoms that had allied with Dublin's Scandinavian rulers. The battle lines reflected political calculations about power and territory rather than ethnic or cultural divisions. The armies that assembled at Clontarf represented the military evolution that had occurred during 2 centuries of Viking-Irish interaction. Brian's forces included traditional Irish warriors fighting with spears and shields, but also cavalry units equipped with Scandinavian-style weapons and armour. The Dublin Vikings deployed in their characteristic wedge formations, but their ranks included Irish allies familiar with local terrain and tactics. Both sides employed mixed forces of infantry and cavalry, with archers providing supporting fire during the initial phases of engagement. The battle itself unfolded across the coastal plain north of Dublin, with both armies deploying in complex formations that reflected the sophisticated military thinking of the early 11th century. Brian's forces held the advantage of numbers, but the Dublin coalition occupied stronger defensive positions closer to their naval support. The fighting began at dawn and continued throughout the day, with neither side able to achieve decisive advantage until late afternoon when the tide began to turn against the Dublin forces. The death of Brian Boru during the final phases of fighting at Clontarf created a political vacuum that would reshape Irish politics for generations. Despite their tactical victory, Brian's forces lacked the leadership necessary to consolidate their gains, while the Dublin Vikings, though defeated, retained control of their urban stronghold and its commercial networks. The battle's outcome demonstrated both the potential and limitations of Irish resistance to Viking settlement, establishing patterns of coexistence that would characterise Irish-Scandinavian relationships for the remainder of the medieval period. The political fragmentation that characterised Ireland following Brian Boru's death at Clontarf created opportunities for ambitious dynasties to expand their territorial control and assert claims to the ancient title of Ard Rí, or High King of Ireland. This concept, which had evolved from earlier Celtic notions of sacred kingship, represented the theoretical apex of Irish political authority, though the practical power of high kings varied dramatically depending on their military capabilities and the political circumstances of their reigns. The institution of high kingship embodied the tension between Ireland's deeply rooted tradition of local autonomy and the periodic emergence of rulers capable of imposing their authority across multiple kingdoms. The office of Ard Rí traced its origins to the prehistoric sacred kingship associated with the Hill of Tara in County Meath, where archaeological evidence reveals continuous ritual activity spanning over 2 millennia. The great ceremonial complex at Tara included the Mound of the Hostages, a passage tomb dating to the Neolithic period that had been transformed into a symbol of royal authority by Celtic kings. The Lia Fail, or Stone of Destiny, stood at the centre of Tara's ceremonial landscape, where tradition claimed it would cry out when touched by Ireland's rightful king. Medieval Irish texts describe elaborate inauguration ceremonies conducted at Tara, involving ritual marriages between kings and sovereignty goddesses, the consumption of sacred meals, and the recitation of genealogies that connected new rulers to mythical ancestors. The practical authority of high kings depended on their ability to extract tribute and military service from subordinate kingdoms throughout Ireland. This system, known as Cain, involved complex networks of obligation that bound lesser kings to their superiors through oaths of loyalty and regular payments of cattle, silver, and military service. The collection of tribute required constant military pressure and diplomatic manoeuvring as subordinate kingdoms sought to minimise their obligations, while high kings struggled to maintain the military forces necessary to enforce their demands. Archaeological evidence from royal sites like Rathcrogan in Connaught reveals the substantial infrastructure required to support these tribute systems, including vast cattle enclosures, workshops for processing tribute goods, and residential complexes for the retainers who administered royal territories. The Uí dynasty emerged as the most successful claimants to high kingship during the early medieval period, establishing a dominance that would persist for over 5 centuries. This powerful kindred traced their descent from Níl Noighialach, a semi-legendary 5th century king whose military campaigns allegedly extended from Ireland to Roman Britain and Gaul. The historical Niall likely ruled a confederation of kingdoms in the northern Midlands during the late 4th or early 5th century, but later genealogists transformed him into a figure of mythic proportions, whose descendants could claim hereditary rights to supreme authority throughout Ireland. The Uí Niall's political strategy involved the systematic colonisation of territories across northern and central Ireland, establishing cadet branches of the dynasty that could provide mutual support while extending family influence into new regions. The northern Uí Niall, based in modern County Donegal, controlled the ancient kingdom of Eileach, whose stone fortress on Griannan of Eileach commanded strategic routes between Ulster and Connaught. Archaeological excavation at this impressive hilltop enclosure has revealed multiple phases of construction spanning several centuries, with the final stone walls rising over 15 feet high and enclosing an area of nearly 2 acres. The fortress served not only as a royal residence, but as a symbol of Uí Niall power that could be seen from vast distances across the Northern Irish landscape. The southern Uí Niall established their power base in the rich agricultural lands of modern County Westmeath, constructing a network of royal residences and ceremonial centres that demonstrated their wealth and political sophistication. The royal site at Uisneach, traditionally considered the geographic centre of Ireland, became a crucial ceremonial venue where southern Uí Niall kings conducted rituals that symbolically asserted their authority over the entire island. Archaeological investigation at Uisneach has revealed evidence of large-scale gatherings, including the remains of massive fire sites that may have been used for ceremonial purposes, and substantial middens containing the bones of cattle consumed during royal feasts. The competition between northern and southern branches of the Uí Niall created a dynamic political situation that prevented either group from establishing permanent dominance over the high kingship. This rivalry encouraged both branches to seek alliances with other powerful dynasties, while investing heavily in military technology and professional warrior bands. The alternation of high kings between the two branches, formalised in later medieval texts as the principle of regree, created a system of shared sovereignty that balanced competing claims while maintaining the fiction of unified royal authority. The Oganachta dynasty of Munster represented the primary challenge to Uí Niall hegemony, controlling the wealthy southwestern province from their ceremonial centre at Cashel. The Rock of Cashel, a dramatic limestone outcrop rising 200 feet above the surrounding plain, provided an imposing setting for royal inauguration ceremonies and served as a powerful symbol of Oganachta authority. Archaeological evidence from the rock's summit reveals the remains of substantial stone buildings dating to the early medieval period, including what may have been a royal hall, capable of accommodating hundreds of guests during ceremonial occasions. The Oganachta claimed descent from Eogan Mór, a legendary ancestor whose genealogy connected the dynasty to the prehistoric peoples of Munster while legitimising their authority over the province's diverse populations. This genealogical tradition, preserved in medieval manuscripts like the Book of Munster, provided detailed accounts of dynastic succession and territorial divisions that regulated inheritance and political authority within the kingdom. The complexity of these genealogical records reflects the sophisticated legal and administrative systems developed by the Oganachta to govern their extensive territories. The wealth of Munster, derived from its fertile agricultural lands and extensive trade networks, provided the Oganachta with resources that rivaled those available to the Ua Ainail. Archaeological evidence from sites like Gorenas in County Cork reveals the sophisticated metalworking capabilities of Oganachta craftsmen, who produced jewellery, weapons, and ceremonial objects of exceptional quality. The discovery of imported pottery, glass, and other luxury goods at Oganachta sites demonstrates the extensive trade connections that linked Munster with continental Europe and the Mediterranean world. The political structure of medieval Ireland operated through a complex hierarchy of kingdoms that reflected both ancient territorial divisions and more recent political developments. At the lowest level, the Tuath remained the basic unit of political organisation, typically encompassing a territory of several hundred square kilometres and supporting a population of perhaps 2,000 individuals. These small kingdoms maintained their own legal systems, military forces and ceremonial centres, though they acknowledged the authority of more powerful neighbours through tribute payments and military service. Regional kingdoms, known as Mortuatha, controlled multiple Tuatha and served as intermediate levels in the political hierarchy. These larger political units typically emerged through conquest or voluntary confederation, with successful war leaders gradually extending their authority over neighbouring territories. The Kingdom of Leinster exemplified this process, as the Uí Dunlang dynasty gradually consolidated control over dozens of smaller kingdoms throughout the eastern regions of Ireland. Archaeological evidence from royal sites like Dunai Linn in County Kildare reveals the substantial infrastructure required to administer these regional kingdoms, including defensive earthworks, ceremonial buildings, and extensive storage facilities for tribute goods. The highest level of political organisation involved the 5 traditional provinces of Ireland: Ulster, Connaught, Leinster, Munster, and Meath. These ancient territorial divisions, which may have originated during the Iron Age, provided the framework within which medieval Irish politics operated. Each province maintained its own identity and traditions, though the boundaries between them shifted frequently as powerful dynasties expanded or contracted their territorial control. The symbolic importance of the provincial structure is reflected in medieval Irish literature, which consistently refers to Ireland as consisting of 5/5, even when political realities bore little resemblance to this idealised division. The legal system that governed relationships between these various political units was codified in the remarkable collection of texts known as the Brecon Laws. These legal codes, which preserved ancient Celtic legal traditions in written form, provided detailed regulations for virtually every aspect of medieval Irish society. The laws recognised the autonomy of individual kingdoms while establishing procedures for resolving disputes between different political units. Complex rules governed the payment of tribute, the conduct of warfare, and the rights and obligations of kings at different levels of the political hierarchy. The Brecon Laws reflected a society that valued legal precedent and customary practice over the arbitrary authority of individual rulers. Kings were bound by legal constraints that limited their power and required them to consult with assemblies of nobles before making important decisions. The laws provided detailed procedures for the deposition of rulers who violated their legal obligations, creating mechanisms for political accountability that were unusual in medieval Europe. Archaeological evidence from sites like the Hill of Ward in County Meath, where legal assemblies may have convened, reveals the substantial infrastructure required to support these legal gatherings. The administration of justice under Brecon law required the services of professional legal experts known as Brecons, who underwent extensive training in the memorization and interpretation of legal texts. These individuals served as judges in legal disputes and advisors to kings on matters of law and precedent. The complexity of Brecon law is evident in texts like the Creath Gablach, which provides detailed classifications of social status and the legal rights associated with different ranks of society. The law's recognition of women's property rights and its sophisticated approaches to compensation for injuries demonstrate the advanced nature of Irish legal thinking. Territorial organisation under the Brecon system involved complex arrangements that balanced individual ownership with collective rights and responsibilities. Land was typically held by kinship groups rather than individuals, with usage rights allocated according to genealogical relationships and social status. The fine or extended family group served as the basic unit of land tenure, controlling territories that might include agricultural land, pasture, bog and woodland. Archaeological evidence from sites like the Seed Fields in County Mayo reveals the sophisticated field systems developed by medieval Irish communities, with stone walls defining individual holdings within larger territorial units controlled by kinship groups. The role of bards and genealogists in legitimising political authority cannot be overstated in understanding medieval Irish society. These learned professionals, known collectively as the AOS Dana, maintained the oral traditions that validated dynastic claims and territorial rights. Their training, which could extend for 12 years or more, involved the memorization of vast quantities of genealogical, historical, and legal material that formed the foundation of political legitimacy. The bards served not only as entertainers, but as historians, legal experts, and political advisors whose knowledge was essential for the functioning of Irish political systems. The genealogical traditions maintained by professional historians provided the framework within which political authority operated. Every king required a genealogy that connected him to appropriate mythical or historical ancestors, while territorial claims needed historical validation through accounts of conquest or inheritance. The complexity of these genealogical systems is evident in manuscripts like the Book of Leinster, which contains hundreds of detailed family trees tracing the descent of Irish dynasties back to legendary founders. These genealogies were not merely academic exercises, but practical political documents that could determine the outcome of succession disputes or territorial conflicts. The emergence of Kenneth MacAlpin as king of both the Picts and the Scots around 843 AD marked a crucial turning point in the political development of medieval Scotland. Kenneth's achievement in uniting these two peoples under a single crown created the foundation for what would become the medieval Kingdom of Alba, though the process of integration would take several generations to complete. The circumstances that enabled Kenneth's success remain partially obscured by limited contemporary sources, but the political consolidation he achieved fundamentally altered the balance of power in northern Britain. Kenneth MacAlpin's background reflected the complex political relationships that had developed between Pictish and Gaelic populations in Scotland during the 8th and 9th centuries. His father, Alpin mac Echdach, appears to have been a king of Dál Riata, the Gaelic kingdom that had been established in western Scotland during the 6th century. Kenneth's maternal lineage, however, may have included Pictish royal blood, providing him with claims to authority in both political systems. This dual heritage positioned Kenneth to take advantage of political crises that weakened both kingdoms during the mid-9th century. The Pictish kingdom that Kenneth inherited had been severely weakened by internal conflicts and external pressures during the early 9th century. Archaeological evidence from major Pictish centres like Forteviot suggests periods of destruction and abandonment that may reflect political instability or military defeats. The distinctive Pictish symbol stones that had been erected throughout eastern Scotland during the 8th century ceased to be produced, suggesting cultural disruption that paralleled political collapse. Viking raids along the Scottish coast added external pressure to internal political problems, creating conditions that favoured political consolidation under strong leadership. The Gaelic kingdom of Dál Riata had faced similar challenges, with Viking control of the Western Islands disrupting traditional trade routes and threatening the kingdom's territorial integrity. The loss of Iona to Viking raiders around 795 AD had deprived Dál Riata of its most important religious centre, while attacks on coastal settlements forced population movements inland. Archaeological evidence from sites like Dunad, the traditional capital of Dál Riata, reveals periods of reduced activity during the early 9th century that may reflect these political and economic pressures. Kenneth's unification of the Pictish and Gaelic kingdoms involved more than simple military conquest, though force certainly played a role in the process. The new kingdom of Alba represented a synthesis of Pictish and Gaelic political traditions, legal systems, and cultural practices that created a distinctive Scottish identity. The choice of Scone as the ceremonial centre for the unified kingdom reflected this synthesis, as the site had served as a major Pictish royal centre while being accessible to Gaelic populations from the west. The Stone of Destiny, which became the symbol of Scottish royal authority, embodied the fusion of Pictish and Gaelic traditions that characterised the new kingdom. This ancient block of sandstone, traditionally associated with the coronation of Scottish kings, may have originated as a Pictish ceremonial object before being adopted by Gaelic rulers. The stone's removal to Scone and its incorporation into Scottish royal ceremonial reflected the systematic creation of new traditions that combined elements from both constituent peoples. The administrative systems developed by Kenneth and his successors drew upon both Pictish and Gaelic precedents, while creating new institutions adapted to the unified kingdom's needs. The territorial organisation of Alba combined Pictish provinces with Gaelic Tuatha, creating a complex system that recognised existing local authorities while establishing royal control over strategic regions. Archaeological evidence from royal sites like Fortiviot reveals the construction of new ceremonial buildings that incorporated architectural elements from both traditions, symbolising the political synthesis that Kenneth had achieved. The legal system of medieval Alba represented a similar fusion of different traditions, with Pictish laws governing some aspects of society, while Gaelic legal principles applied to others. The Brecon legal tradition, brought from Ireland by Gaelic settlers, provided frameworks for resolving disputes and regulating social relationships, while Pictish legal customs continued to influence property rights and territorial organisation. This legal pluralism created a complex but flexible system that could accommodate the diverse populations within the unified kingdom. The role of the Church in legitimising Kenneth's authority and supporting the unification process was crucial to the success of his political project. The establishment of new religious centres and the patronage of existing monasteries provided Kenneth with moral authority while creating networks of communication and administration that extended royal influence throughout the kingdom. The monastery at Dunkeld, which Kenneth founded and endowed with relics of St. Columba brought from Iona, became a symbol of the religious unity that paralleled political consolidation. The cultural synthesis that occurred in medieval Alba extended beyond political and legal institutions to encompass artistic traditions, language, and social customs. Sculptors working for the new royal court created monuments that combined Pictish symbol stones with Gaelic high crosses, producing distinctive hybrid forms that reflected the kingdom's dual heritage. The Sueño stone near Forres, though possibly predating Kenneth's reign, exemplifies this artistic synthesis with its combination of Pictish symbols and narrative scenes that may commemorate military victories. The gradual Gaelicization of Alba occurred through processes that were both deliberate and organic, as Gaelic language and customs spread throughout the former Pictish territories. The superior preservation of Gaelic literary traditions, maintained by professional bards and scribes, may have given Gaelic culture advantages in the competition for cultural dominance. Archaeological evidence suggests that material culture throughout Scotland became increasingly uniform during the 9th and 10th centuries, reflecting the cultural integration that accompanied political unification. The expansion of Alba under Kenneth's successors demonstrated the military and political potential that unification had created. The kingdom's armies, combining Pictish and Gaelic military traditions, proved capable of defending Scottish territory against Viking raids while expanding southward into formerly Anglo-Saxon territories. The capture of Edinburgh and the extension of Scottish authority into the Lothians reflected the growing power of the unified kingdom and its ability to compete with other major powers in medieval Britain. The political consolidation achieved by the kings of Alba during the 10th and 11th centuries created a powerful northern kingdom that could challenge Anglo-Saxon and later Norman authority in Britain. However, the fragmented nature of Irish political authority made the island vulnerable to external intervention, when internal conflicts provided opportunities for ambitious foreign adventurers. The invitation extended to Anglo-Norman mercenaries by Dermot MacMurrough, the deposed King of Leinster, in 1167 would prove to be one of the most consequential decisions in Irish history, opening the door to a conquest that would fundamentally alter the relationship between Gaelic and Norman cultures across the Irish Sea. Dermot MacMurrough's expulsion from his kingdom resulted from the complex web of alliances and enmities that characterised 12th century Irish politics. As King of Leinster, Dermot had pursued an aggressive expansionist policy that brought him into conflict with Tiernan O'Rourke of Briefna, particularly over Dermot's abduction of O'Rourke's wife, Dev O'Gilla. This personal affront became a political crisis when O'Rourke allied with Rory O'Connor, the High King of Ireland, to drive Dermot from his territories in 1166. The military campaign that followed demonstrated the continuing effectiveness of traditional Irish warfare when multiple kingdoms united against a common enemy, forcing Dermot to flee across the Irish Sea to seek assistance from Henry II of England. The Anglo-Norman court that Dermot encountered in Aquitaine was populated by ambitious knights seeking opportunities to establish their own lordships in an age when primogeniture limited inheritance prospects for younger sons. Henry II, though initially cautious about direct involvement in Irish affairs, granted Dermot permission to recruit volunteers from among his Anglo-Norman subjects. This authorisation, formalised in a letter that has not survived but is referenced in contemporary chronicles, effectively opened Ireland to Norman military intervention while allowing Henry to maintain plausible deniability about his ultimate intentions regarding the island. The first Anglo-Norman adventurers to respond to Dermot's appeals were relatively minor figures seeking to improve their fortunes through military service. Robert Fitzstephen, a half-Welsh knight with limited prospects in Wales, agreed to provide military support in exchange for the promise of territorial grants in Leinster. Maurice de Prendergast, another Welsh marcher lord, brought a small force of archers and men-at-arms who possessed experience in the brutal frontier warfare that characterised the Welsh borders. These initial expeditions, launched in 1169, involved forces numbering only in the hundreds rather than the thousands, but their superior military technology and tactics would prove devastatingly effective against traditional Irish armies. The military equipment that the Anglo-Normans brought to Ireland represented the culmination of centuries of military development in Western Europe. Their knights wore hauberks of mail armour that provided comprehensive protection against Irish weapons, while their conical helmets with nasal guards protected their heads from sword blows. The Norman kite shields, constructed from wood and leather with iron reinforcement, were larger and more effective than traditional Irish round shields. Most significantly, the Normans fought as heavy cavalry, with destriers trained for mounted combat and equipped with high-cantled saddles that provided secure seats for armoured riders wielding couched lances. The Norman crossbowmen who accompanied these expeditions possessed weapons that could penetrate Irish armour at ranges far exceeding those of traditional Irish javelins or slings. The crossbow bolts, fitted with steel points designed to punch through mail, could kill or disable Irish warriors before they could close to effective fighting range. Archaeological evidence from Norman sites in Wales reveals the sophisticated metallurgy required to produce these weapons, with crossbow prods made from composite materials that combined steel and horn to achieve optimal performance. The tactical systems employed by Anglo-Norman forces had been refined through generations of warfare in France and along the Welsh marches. The combination of heavy cavalry charges supported by disciplined infantry and missile troops created a combined arms approach that could overwhelm enemies who lacked similar coordination. Norman commanders understood how to use terrain to their advantage, selecting battlefields that maximised the effectiveness of their cavalry while limiting the mobility of Irish forces. The construction of temporary fortifications using portable equipment allowed Norman forces to establish secure bases even in hostile territory. The Irish military response to the Norman invasion revealed both the strengths and limitations of traditional Gaelic warfare. Irish armies consisted primarily of lightly armed infantry equipped with spears, swords, and small shields, supported by limited numbers of cavalry mounted on horses unsuited for heavy combat. Irish warriors wore minimal armour, typically leather jerkins reinforced with metal studs, which provided little protection against Norman weapons. The Irish tactical approach emphasised individual combat prowess and the psychological impact of fierce charges, but lacked the disciplined formations that made Norman armies so effective. The Battle of Killistown in 1169 demonstrated the devastating impact of Norman military superiority on traditional Irish forces. Dermot MacMurrough's Irish allies, supported by Robert Fitzstephen's Normans, encountered a coalition army led by the men of Wexford. The Irish forces, numbering several thousand warriors, initially held advantages in numbers and local knowledge, but the Norman cavalry charge broke their battle line within minutes of contact. Contemporary chronicles describe Irish warriors fleeing in panic as armoured horsemen rode down foot soldiers who had never faced such tactics. The psychological impact of this defeat spread throughout Leinster, convincing many Irish lords that resistance to Norman forces was futile. The success of these initial expeditions encouraged more ambitious Norman adventurers to seek their fortunes in Ireland. Richard de Clare, Earl of Pembroke, known to history as Strongbow, negotiated directly with Dermot MacMurrough for a more substantial intervention. The agreement they reached promised Strongbow marriage to Dermot's daughter Aoife and inheritance of the Kingdom of Leinster in exchange for military support. This arrangement represented a fundamental departure from traditional Irish political practices, which did not recognise inheritance through marriage to foreign nobles, but Dermot's desperate circumstances left him with few alternatives. Strongbow's expedition, launched in 1170, brought significantly larger forces to Ireland than previous Norman interventions. His army included several hundred knights supported by thousands of Welsh archers and men-at-arms, creating a military force capable of conducting sustained campaigns against major Irish armies. The logistical preparations for this expedition required months of planning, with ships assembled to transport not only troops but also their horses, weapons and supplies. Archaeological evidence from Norman bases in Wales reveals the extensive preparations required for such expeditions, including the stockpiling of crossbow bolts, horseshoes and other military equipment. The Siege of Waterford in 1170 showcased Norman expertise in assault warfare against fortified positions. The Viking town's walls, constructed from timber and earthwork, had withstood Irish attacks for generations, but Norman siege techniques proved devastatingly effective. Strongbow's forces constructed siege engines, including mangonels capable of hurling stones against the walls, while miners worked to undermine the fortifications. The assault, when it came, combined coordinated attacks from multiple directions with the use of scaling ladders and siege towers that allowed Norman troops to reach the wall tops. The fall of Waterford after a brief siege demonstrated that traditional Irish fortifications could not withstand Norman siege warfare. The capture of Dublin in 1170 marked the effective end of organised Irish resistance to the initial Norman invasion. The city's position controlling access to the Irish interior made it a crucial strategic objective, while its wealth from trade provided resources that could fund further military operations. The Norman assault on Dublin employed similar tactics to those used at Waterford, but the city's stronger fortifications and larger garrison required a more systematic approach. Archaeological excavation in modern Dublin has revealed evidence of the destruction that accompanied the Norman conquest, including burned buildings and hastily buried treasure hoards that reflect the panic that gripped the city's inhabitants. The death of Dermot MacMurrough in 1171 created a succession crisis that would determine whether Norman gains in Ireland could be consolidated or would prove temporary. According to traditional Irish law, Strongbow's marriage to Aoife provided no claim to the Kingdom of Leinster, which should have passed to male members of Dermot's extended family. However, Strongbow's military strength allowed him to enforce his claim despite its questionable legal basis. The Norman lord's assumption of an Irish royal title represented a fundamental challenge to Gaelic political traditions and established precedents that would influence Anglo-Norman expansion throughout Ireland. Henry II's intervention in Ireland during 1171 to 1172 transformed what had begun as private military adventures into a systematic royal conquest. The English king's arrival with a large army demonstrated his determination to control Norman activities in Ireland, while asserting his own authority over the island. Henry's forces, numbering several thousand knights and men-at-arms, represented the largest military expedition to Ireland since the legendary invasions of prehistoric times. The logistical challenges of transporting and supplying such a force across the Irish Sea required unprecedented organisational efforts by the English royal administration. The submission of Irish kings to Henry II at Dublin and Cashel reflected both the military reality of Norman superiority and the pragmatic calculations of Gaelic rulers seeking to preserve their positions under the new political order. Kings like Dermot McCarthy of Desmond and Donal O'Brien of Thomond recognised that resistance would likely result in their complete dispossession, while submission offered possibilities for retaining reduced territories under Norman overlordship. The ceremonies of submission, conducted according to feudal protocols unfamiliar to Irish participants, symbolically transformed independent Gaelic kings into vassals of the English crown. The Treaty of Windsor in 1175 between Henry II and Rory O'Connor attempted to establish a framework for coexistence between Norman and Gaelic authorities in Ireland. Under its terms, O'Connor retained recognition as High King of those parts of Ireland not already granted to Norman lords, while acknowledging Henry's overall supremacy. The treaty's provisions for tribute payments and military service reflected feudal concepts that had little basis in Irish political tradition, creating ambiguities that would generate conflicts for generations. Archaeological evidence from royal sites like Rathcrogan suggests that O'Connor attempted to maintain traditional royal functions despite his reduced circumstances, continuing to hold assemblies and collect tribute from subordinate kingdoms. The Norman settlement pattern that emerged in conquered territories differed fundamentally from traditional Irish approaches to territorial organisation. Norman lords constructed motte and bailey castles at strategic locations, creating fortified centres that could control surrounding countryside while providing refuge during Irish counterattacks. These earthwork fortifications, consisting of artificial mounds topped with wooden towers and surrounded by defended courtyards, could be constructed rapidly using local labour and materials. Archaeological investigation of Norman motters throughout Ireland has revealed the sophisticated engineering required for their construction, with carefully designed drainage systems and timber frameworks that provided structural stability. The town of Kilkenny, established by Strongbow as his principal seat in Leinster, exemplified the urban development that accompanied Norman conquest. The town's location on the River Nore provided access to both land and water transportation routes, while its position in the heart of rich agricultural territory ensured adequate food supplies for its population. Norman urban planning created defended settlements with regular street layouts, market squares, and walls that protected merchants and craftsmen. Archaeological excavation in Kilkenny has revealed evidence of rapid urban growth during the late 12th century, with substantial stone buildings replacing earlier timber structures within decades of the Norman arrival. The introduction of feudal land tenure revolutionised property relationships in Norman-controlled territories. The system of knight service which granted land in exchange for military obligations, created networks of mutual dependence that bound Norman lords to their English overlords while providing military resources for territorial defence. Subin feudation allowed major Norman lords to grant portions of their territories to lesser nobles, creating hierarchies of obligation that extended from the King of England down to individual knights holding single manors. Archaeological evidence from Norman manor houses reveals the material culture associated with this new social system, including defensive features that reflected the military obligations of feudal tenure. The displacement of Gaelic populations from the most fertile lands in Norman-controlled territories created refugee populations that would become sources of continuing resistance to foreign rule. Irish families who had held land for generations found themselves dispossessed in favour of Norman knights who possessed no historical connection to their territories. Some displaced Irish lords retreated to marginal lands in upland or bog regions where Norman heavy cavalry could not operate effectively, establishing bases for guerrilla warfare against Norman settlements. Others sought service with Norman lords as mercenaries or administrators, adapting to the new political order while maintaining their cultural identity. The Gaelic response to Norman conquest evolved from initial shock and disorganisation to more sophisticated forms of military and cultural resistance. Irish kings who retained their territories began adopting Norman military technologies and tactics, importing mail armour, crossbows and destriers to equip their own forces. The Kingdom of Connaught under Cathal Crovderg O'Connor demonstrated this adaptive strategy, maintaining independence through a combination of military modernisation and diplomatic manoeuvring that played Norman factions against each other. Archaeological evidence from Connaught royal sites shows the introduction of Norman-style fortifications alongside traditional Irish defensive works, reflecting the hybrid military systems that emerged in response to conquest. The development of galloglass warriors represented the most significant Gaelic military innovation of this period. These heavily armed infantry, recruited initially from the Scottish Hebrides and later from Ireland itself, were equipped with mail armour, steel helmets, and large two-handed swords that could match Norman knights in close combat. The galloglass fought in disciplined formations similar to those employed by Norman infantry, but retained the fierce fighting spirit that characterised Gaelic warrior culture. Their effectiveness against Norman cavalry was demonstrated in numerous engagements throughout the 13th century, forcing Norman commanders to modify their tactical approaches when facing these formidable opponents. The galloglass military system reflected the broader cultural exchange that occurred between Gaelic Ireland and the Norse Gaelic populations of western Scotland. Warriors from families like the MacDonalds and MacSweeneys brought not only military expertise, but also cultural traditions that enriched Irish society. The intermarriage between galloglass families and Irish nobility created kinship networks that extended across the Irish Sea, facilitating the continued recruitment of Scottish warriors for Irish service. Archaeological evidence from galloglass settlements reveals the distinctive material culture of these warrior communities, including weapons and jewellery that combined Gaelic and Scandinavian artistic traditions. The process of hibernicization began almost immediately after the Norman conquest, as foreign settlers adapted to Irish conditions and cultural influences. Norman lords who established themselves in remote regions found that maintaining connections with England became increasingly difficult and expensive, while integration with local Irish populations offered practical advantages for governing their territories. Intermarriage between Norman knights and Irish noblewomen created families with claims to both feudal and Gaelic legitimacy, while the adoption of Irish customs and language facilitated communication with native populations. The Fitzgerald family exemplified this process of cultural adaptation, with successive generations becoming increasingly Irish in their customs and loyalties. Gerald of Wales, writing in the late 12th century, already noted the tendency of Norman settlers to adopt Irish dress, language, and social practices. By the 13th century, branches of the Fitzgerald family had established themselves as virtually independent rulers in Desmond and Kildare, maintaining only nominal allegiance to the English crown while governing according to Gaelic principles. Archaeological evidence from Fitzgerald castles reveals the gradual adoption of Irish architectural features and decorative motifs, reflecting the cultural synthesis that characterised Hibernicized Norman families. The adoption of Gaelic legal traditions by Norman settlers reflected practical necessities rather than romantic attachment to Irish culture. The Brecon law system provided established procedures for resolving disputes between different ethnic groups and offered mechanisms for integrating foreign settlers into existing social networks. Norman lords who married Irish wives found themselves bound by Gaelic kinship obligations that could conflict with feudal duties, creating complex legal situations that required creative solutions. The survival of Gaelic legal manuscripts from Norman-controlled territories demonstrates the continued vitality of Irish legal traditions despite political conquest. The cultural influence operated in both directions, with Irish society adopting Norman innovations in agriculture, architecture, and administration. The introduction of the heavy plough revolutionised farming in suitable areas, allowing cultivation of heavier soils that had previously been unsuitable for agriculture. Norman mills, both water-powered and windmills, increased the efficiency of grain processing while generating income for their owners through multure rights. Archaeological evidence from Norman manors reveals the systematic field systems and improved livestock breeds that increased agricultural productivity in conquered territories. The architectural legacy of the Norman invasion transformed the Irish landscape through the construction of stone castles that replaced earlier timber fortifications. These massive structures, exemplified by castles like Kilkenny and Trim, required sophisticated engineering knowledge and substantial financial resources that demonstrated the wealth and power of their builders. The military architecture incorporated lessons learned from Crusader fortifications in the Holy Land, with concentric defences, flanking towers, and carefully designed approaches that maximised defensive advantages. Archaeological investigation of these castles has revealed the complex construction processes involved, with evidence of specialised craftsmen imported from England and France to supervise building projects. The ecclesiastical architecture of the Norman period reflected the religious reforms that accompanied political conquest. Norman lords patronised religious orders like the Cistercians and Augustinians that brought continental European monastic traditions to Ireland. The construction of Gothic cathedrals and abbey churches introduced architectural styles that had originated in France, while maintaining elements of Irish artistic tradition in their decorative details. The ruins of Mellifont Abbey, founded by the Cistercians in 1142, demonstrate the sophisticated architectural knowledge that Norman religious communities brought to Ireland, with features like ribbed vaulting and pointed arches that were innovations in Irish building practice. In Scotland, the resistance to Anglo-Norman expansion took different forms due to the unified political structure that had emerged under the descendants of Kenneth MacAlpin. The wars of Scottish independence, beginning with the succession crisis following the death of Alexander III in 1286, would test the kingdom's ability to maintain its independence against English pressure. The complex legal disputes over the Scottish succession provided Edward VI of England with opportunities to assert overlordship over Scotland, leading to military interventions that would define Anglo-Scottish relations for generations. Robert the Bruce's emergence as a leader of Scottish resistance reflected both his Norman heritage and his integration into Gaelic political networks. The Bruce family had arrived in Scotland during the 12th century as part of the Anglo-Norman settlement, encouraged by David I, but successive generations had intermarried with Scottish noble families and adopted Gaelic cultural practices. Robert's grandfather had been a claimant to the Scottish throne during the Great Cause of 1291 to 1292, providing the family with royal ambitions that transcended ethnic divisions. The younger Robert's coronation at Scone in 1306 symbolically connected him to the ancient traditions of Scottish kingship while asserting his right to resist English domination. The military campaigns that established Bruce's authority over Scotland required alliances with the Gaelic lords who controlled the Highland regions where traditional clan structures remained intact. These alliances involved complex negotiations that balanced feudal obligations with Gaelic concepts of kinship and loyalty. The support that Bruce received from families like the MacDonalds and Campbells reflected their calculation that Scottish independence offered better prospects than English rule, while Bruce's acknowledgement of Gaelic customs and territorial rights secured their military assistance. Archaeological evidence from Highland castles of this period reveals the construction of fortifications that combined Norman military architecture with features adapted to Highland warfare, reflecting the hybrid military culture that emerged during the Independence Wars. The devastating impact of the Black Death across Europe between 1347 and 1351 created unprecedented opportunities for Gaelic resurgence throughout Ireland and Scotland. The plague, which may have killed up to 40% of Ireland's population, struck Anglo-Norman settlements with particular severity due to their higher population density and extensive trade connections with infected continental ports. Archaeological evidence from Norman towns like New Ross and Kilkenny reveals sudden abandonment of entire street sections, with hastily dug mass graves containing dozens of bodies buried without the elaborate funeral rites that had characterised medieval Christian practice. The demographic catastrophe that followed fundamentally altered the balance of power between Norman colonists and Gaelic populations, as labour shortages and economic disruption weakened the administrative and military systems that had maintained foreign control over conquered territories. The retreat of Anglo-Norman authority from marginal lands began almost immediately after the plague's initial impact, as surviving colonists concentrated in the most defensible and economically viable settlements. The Statute of Kilkenny, enacted in 1366, represented a desperate attempt by the colonial government to halt the process of hibernicization that had accelerated during the demographic crisis. This legislation prohibited English settlers from adopting Irish customs, speaking the Gaelic language, or intermarrying with Irish families, while mandating the use of English law and the maintenance of English cultural practices. However, the statute's very existence testified to the widespread adoption of Gaelic culture among Norman families, and its enforcement proved impossible given the reduced administrative capacity of the colonial government. Archaeological excavation at abandoned Norman settlements throughout the Irish Midlands reveals the material evidence of this retreat. Sites like the deserted village of Newtown Jerpoint in County Kilkenny show sudden abandonment during the late 14th century, with valuable items left in houses and workshops as their owners fled to more secure locations. The pottery assemblages from these sites demonstrate the hybrid material culture that had developed in Norman Ireland, combining English ceramic traditions with Irish cooking practices and vessel forms. The abandonment of these settlements allowed Gaelic populations to reoccupy territories from which they had been excluded for nearly 2 centuries, reversing the territorial losses that had followed the initial Norman conquest. The O'Brien dynasty of Thomond exemplified the Gaelic recovery that occurred throughout Ireland during this period. Based at their ancestral seat of Clonroad near modern Ennis, the O'Briens had maintained nominal submission to English authority while preserving their traditional territories and customs. The demographic crisis of the mid-14th century allowed them to expand their influence eastward into the fertile lands of County Limerick, where abandoned Norman manors provided ready-made agricultural infrastructure. Archaeological evidence from O'Brien castles of this period reveals sophisticated stone construction techniques that combine traditional Irish defensive concepts with architectural innovations borrowed from Norman military engineering. The Tower House, which became the characteristic fortified residence of late medieval Gaelic lords, represented a distinctive architectural response to the changed political circumstances of post-plague Ireland. These structures, typically rising 4 to 6 stories and constructed from local stone, provided secure residences for noble families while demonstrating their wealth and status to potential rivals. The Tower House at Bunratty, rebuilt by the O'Briens during the 15th century, exemplifies the sophisticated design principles that govern these buildings. Its walls, over 8 feet thick at the base, incorporated murder holes, spiral staircases designed to favour right-handed defenders, and carefully positioned arrow loops that provided comprehensive fields of fire around the structure's base. The internal arrangements of tower houses reflected the social hierarchies and cultural practices of Gaelic society. The ground floor typically served as storage space and accommodation for livestock during periods of danger, while the second floor housed the main hall, where the lord received visitors and conducted business. Private chambers on the upper floors provided residential space for the lord's family, with the topmost level often serving as a solo or private retreat. Archaeological investigation of tower houses throughout Ireland has revealed sophisticated drainage systems, guard-robes connected to external chutes, and evidence of elaborate timber fittings that provided comfort and display appropriate to aristocratic residences. The proliferation of tower houses across the Irish landscape during the 15th and 16th centuries reflected the economic recovery and political confidence of Gaelic society. Over 3,000 of these structures were constructed throughout Ireland, creating a network of fortified residences that dominated local territories while providing mutual support during conflicts. The concentration of tower houses in regions like Clare, Galway and Mayo demonstrates the territorial expansion of Gaelic lordships during this period, as families like the O'Briens, O'Flahertys and Burkes established control over extensive territories that had previously been contested or abandoned. The architectural sophistication of late medieval Irish tower houses required substantial financial resources and technical expertise that testified to the economic vitality of Gaelic society. The quarrying and transport of building stone involved complex logistical arrangements, while the construction process required skilled masons capable of creating the precise joinery needed for defensive features like machicolations and bartizans. The decorative elements incorporated into many tower houses, including carved limestone window surrounds and elaborate chimney pieces, demonstrate the artistic capabilities of Irish craftsmen and the cultural ambitions of their patrons. The revival of Gaelic political institutions accompanied the territorial recovery of the 14th and 15th centuries. Traditional assemblies, which had been suppressed or marginalised during the period of Norman dominance, resumed their functions as centres of legal, political and cultural activity. The O'Neill Assembly at Tulloghoge in County Tyrone, where the Earls of Tyrone were inaugurated according to ancient Gaelic ritual, attracted representatives from throughout Ulster and beyond. Archaeological investigation at Tulloghoge has revealed the remains of a substantial stone chair, possibly the coronation seat used in these ceremonies, along with evidence of large gatherings that included temporary structures to accommodate hundreds of participants. The legal system that governed these revived Gaelic territories combined traditional Brecon law with selective adaptations of Norman legal concepts. Professional legal families like the McKeegans and O'Devorans maintained schools where aspiring Brecons underwent extensive training in legal precedents, genealogical traditions, and the complex procedures required for dispute resolution. The legal manuscripts produced by these schools, written in classical modern Irish, preserve detailed records of legal decisions and precedents that demonstrate the sophisticated jurisprudence of late medieval Gaelic society. The McKeegan Law School at Dunnerry in County Galway produced manuscripts that were consulted by legal practitioners throughout Connaught and Munster, creating networks of legal authority that transcended individual lordships. The development of classical modern Irish as a standardised literary language represented one of the most significant cultural achievements of the Gaelic revival. This artificial literary language, based on Middle Irish, but incorporating elements from various regional dialects, provided a medium for sophisticated literary expression that could be understood by educated audiences throughout the Gaelic world. The standardisation process involved professional poets and scribes working in different regions to establish common grammatical rules, spelling conventions, and vocabulary that transcended local variations. The result was a literary language of remarkable flexibility and precision that remained the standard medium for Gaelic literature until the 17th century. The Beardic schools that developed and maintained classical modern Irish operated as sophisticated educational institutions that preserved and transmitted the cultural heritage of Gaelic society. Students at schools like those maintained by the O'Dailys in Cork and the Macwards in Donegal underwent training that could extend for 12 years or more, progressing through carefully structured curricula that included metrics, grammar, genealogy, history, and law. The pedagogical methods employed in these schools emphasised memorisation of vast quantities of traditional material, with students required to master hundreds of poems, genealogies and legal texts before qualifying as professional poets or historians. The literary output of the Bardic schools encompassed a wide range of genres that served both entertainment and practical political functions. Praise poetry, composed for noble patrons, celebrated their achievements while establishing their genealogical credentials and territorial claims. Elegiac poetry commemorated deceased lords, while providing historical records of their reigns and accomplishments. Satirical poetry served as a weapon of political warfare, with skilled poets capable of destroying reputations and undermining political authority through cleverly crafted verses that exposed their targets' weaknesses or failures. The Book of the Dean of Lismore, compiled into the early 16th century by James MacGregor, provides crucial evidence for the literary culture of Gaelic Scotland during this period. This manuscript, written in a unique orthography that used Scots spelling conventions to represent Gaelic sounds, contains over 300 poems ranging from classical bardic compositions to popular ballads. The collection demonstrates the cultural connections that linked Scottish and Irish Gaelic communities, with poems by Irish authors appearing alongside works by Scottish poets. The manuscript's inclusion of both learned and popular poetry reflects the diverse literary culture that flourished in late medieval Gaelic society. The architectural patronage of Gaelic lords extended beyond military fortifications to encompass religious buildings that demonstrated their piety and cultural sophistication. The reconstruction of Clonmacnoise by the O'Kellys during the 15th century involved extensive renovation of the monastery's churches and the construction of the elaborate tomb sculptures that rank among the finest achievements of late medieval Irish art. The O'Kelly tomb in the cathedral at Clonmacnoise features intricate stone carving that combines traditional Irish interlace patterns with Renaissance-influenced figurative sculpture, demonstrating the cosmopolitan artistic influences that reached Gaelic Ireland through trade and diplomatic contacts. The Cistercian Abbey of Knockmoy in County Galway, patronised by the O'Kelly kings of Uí Main, exemplifies the sophisticated architectural programmes undertaken by Gaelic patrons during this period. The Abbey Church, rebuilt during the late 13th and early 14th centuries, incorporates Gothic architectural features derived from continental European models, while maintaining distinctly Irish decorative elements. The surviving wall paintings in the chancel, dating to the early 14th century, represent some of the finest medieval painting to survive in Ireland, with sophisticated iconographic programmes that demonstrate the theological learning of their creators. The economic foundations that supported this cultural flowering rested on agricultural innovations and expanded trade networks that connected Gaelic Ireland with continental European markets. The introduction of new crops, including oats varieties better suited to Irish climatic conditions, increased agricultural productivity and supported larger populations. Archaeological evidence from rural settlements throughout Ireland reveals improvements in housing quality and material culture that reflect rising living standards during the late medieval period. The remains of stone houses with sophisticated drainage systems and evidence of specialised craft activities demonstrate the economic vitality of Gaelic rural communities. The expansion of cattle raising, which had always been central to Gaelic economic systems, reached new levels of sophistication during this period. Irish cattle breeds, adapted to local conditions through centuries of selective breeding, produced animals that were highly valued in European markets. The export of live cattle, hides and salted beef provided Gaelic lords with the resources needed to finance their cultural and military activities. Archaeological evidence from coastal settlements like Galway and Dingle reveals the infrastructure required to support this trade, including specialised processing facilities and warehouses for storing export commodities. The wine trade that connected Western Ireland with the vineyards of Bordeaux and Spain provided Gaelic elites with access to luxury goods and continental cultural influences. Irish merchants established permanent communities in cities like La Rochelle and Bordeaux, creating networks of commercial and cultural exchange that facilitated the flow of ideas as well as commodities. The archaeological record from Irish ports contains substantial quantities of imported pottery, glassware, and other luxury items that testify to the volume and sophistication of this international commerce. The diplomatic relationships that Gaelic lords maintained with continental European powers reflected their integration into wider European political networks. The O'Neill Earls of Tyrone corresponded with Spanish monarchs, seeking military support for their conflicts with English authorities while offering their territories as bases for Spanish operations against English interests. These diplomatic initiatives required sophisticated knowledge of European politics and the maintenance of agents at foreign courts who could represent Gaelic interests effectively. The survival of diplomatic correspondence in Spanish and papal archives provides evidence of the international dimensions of late medieval Gaelic politics. The military innovations that accompanied Gaelic political recovery included the adoption of gunpowder weapons and the development of new tactical systems adapted to Irish conditions. Irish lords imported cannon from continental European manufacturers, installing these weapons in their castles and using them in siege warfare against rival fortifications. The O'Neill Castle at Dungannon was equipped with artillery that could command the surrounding countryside, while the Burke stronghold at Loch Mask incorporated gun loops designed for firearms into its defensive walls. Archaeological excavation at these sites has revealed cannonballs, gunpowder storage facilities, and other evidence of the military revolution that transformed late medieval warfare. The Galaglas military system evolved during this period to incorporate firearms alongside traditional weapons, creating hybrid formations that combine the shock power of heavy infantry with the range and penetration of gunpowder weapons. Galoglas units began including arquebusiers who provided missile support for the axe-armed warriors who remained the core of these formations. The training required to maintain proficiency with both traditional and modern weapons increased the cost and complexity of maintaining Galoglas forces, but also enhanced their effectiveness against both Irish and English opponents. The cultural connections between Ireland and Scotland intensified during the late medieval period, with regular exchanges of warriors, scholars, and craftsmen that maintained the unity of Gaelic civilization despite political divisions. The MacLeod chiefs of Harris and Dunvegan maintained professional poets who composed in classical modern Irish and participated in the literary culture that spanned the entire Gaelic world. The architectural similarities between Scottish and Irish tower houses reflect the movement of master craftsmen who carried construction techniques and decorative traditions between different regions of the Gaelic world. The Lordship of the Isles, established by the MacDonald clan during the 14th century, created a semi-independent Gaelic state that controlled the western Scottish islands and parts of the Highland mainland. This maritime kingdom maintained its own diplomatic relations with European powers while preserving traditional Gaelic cultural institutions. The MacDonalds patronised bardic schools, commissioned elaborate stone sculptures, and maintained fleets of galleys that dominated the western Scottish waters. Archaeological evidence from MacDonald strongholds like Finlagan on Islay reveals the sophisticated material culture of this Gaelic maritime empire, with imported luxury goods and evidence of specialised craft production that supported aristocratic lifestyles. The decline of the Lordship of the Isles during the late 15th century resulted from internal conflicts and pressure from the Scottish Crown rather than cultural assimilation or economic failure. The forfeiture of the lordship in 1493 represented a political defeat rather than cultural collapse. As Gaelic institutions and traditions continued to flourish, throughout the Western Highlands and Islands under different political arrangements. The survival of Gaelic poetry, music and legal traditions in these regions demonstrates the resilience of Gaelic culture despite political setbacks. The religious life of late medieval Gaelic society combined traditional Christian observances with distinctive Irish practices that had developed during centuries of relative independence from continental European ecclesiastical authority. Irish monasteries maintained their ancient traditions while selectively adopting reforms promoted by international religious orders. The Franciscan friaries established throughout Gaelic Ireland during the 13th and 14th centuries provided new centres of learning and spiritual life that complemented rather than replaced existing monastic institutions. The Franciscan house at Quin in County Clare, founded by the McNamara lords during the 14th century, exemplifies the architectural and cultural synthesis that characterised late medieval Irish religious life. The friary buildings incorporate Gothic architectural elements derived from continental models, while maintaining proportions and decorative details that reflect Irish aesthetic preferences. The survival of Gaelic manuscripts from the Quin Library demonstrates the continued vitality of Irish intellectual traditions within reformed religious communities. The development of pilgrimage sites throughout Gaelic Ireland created networks of religious and cultural exchange that connected local communities with broader spiritual movements. Croagh Patrick in County Mayo attracted pilgrims from throughout Ireland and beyond, generating economic activity that supported local communities while reinforcing cultural identities associated with particular regions and lordships. The archaeological evidence from pilgrimage sites includes distinctive badges, tokens, and other objects that pilgrims purchased as souvenirs, creating material records of the religious practices that shaped late medieval Gaelic spirituality. The artistic achievements of late medieval Gaelic society encompassed metalworking, stone carving, and manuscript illumination that combined traditional Irish techniques with innovations derived from continental European sources. The Shrine of St. Patrick's Bell, created during the early 12th century but representative of artistic traditions that continued throughout the medieval period, demonstrates the technical mastery of Irish craftsmen. Its bronze casing incorporates intricate interlace patterns executed in repousse technique, while crystal and enamel inlays provide coloristic effects that enhance the overall decorative programme. The stone carving traditions that flourished in late medieval Ireland produced tomb sculptures and architectural decoration of exceptional quality. The tomb of Piers Fitzgerald in Kilmallock demonstrates the sophisticated sculptural programmes that adorn the burial places of Hibernicized Norman families. The effigy, carved from limestone with remarkable attention to detail, depicts the deceased in full armour, while incorporating heraldic and religious symbols that reflect his cultural and political affiliations. The quality of the carving rivals contemporary work produced in major European centres, demonstrating the high standards achieved by Irish sculptors. The accession of Henry VIII to the English throne in 1509 marked the beginning of the most systematic and devastating assault on Gaelic civilization in its entire history. Unlike his medieval predecessors, who had been content with nominal overlordship and tribute payments from Irish lords, Henry possessed both the administrative machinery and ideological motivation to transform Ireland into a fully integrated component of his expanding Tudor state. The king's assertion of the title King of Ireland in 1542, replacing the medieval designation Lord of Ireland, represented far more than ceremonial grandstanding. It signalled a fundamental shift in English policy from accommodation with Gaelic political structures to their complete replacement with centralised royal authority administered through English law and Protestant religious institutions. The surrender and regrant policy, implemented systematically from the 1540s onward, represented the most sophisticated attempt yet devised to destroy Gaelic political authority through legal mechanisms rather than military conquest alone. Under this system, Gaelic lords were required to formally surrender their territories to the English crown, renounce their traditional titles, and accept new English titles along with grants of their former lands under English law. The policy's architects understood that traditional Gaelic lordship derived its legitimacy from ancient genealogical claims, customary law, and the consent of subordinate clans. By forcing lords to accept their territories as royal grants rather than ancestral inheritances, the Tudor administration sought to transform autonomous Gaelic rulers into dependent vassals, whose authority derived solely from royal favour. Con O'Neill, the powerful Earl of Tyrone, exemplified both the attractions and contradictions inherent in the surrender and regrant system. In 1542 he travelled to Greenwich Palace, where he formally surrendered his territories to Henry VIII, renounced his Gaelic title of the O'Neill, and accepted the English title Earl of Tyrone along with a regrunt of his lands under English law. The ceremony, conducted with elaborate pageantry designed to emphasise royal magnificence, required O'Neill to kneel before the king while dressed in English court attire rather than traditional Irish clothing. Contemporary accounts describe the Irish lord's obvious discomfort with protocols that violated Gaelic concepts of honour and equality between rulers, but his acceptance of the arrangement reflected his calculation that accommodation offered better prospects than resistance. The practical implications of surrender and regrant extended far beyond ceremonial submissions. English law recognised only male primogeniture inheritance, directly contradicting Gaelic traditions of tanistry that allowed succession by the most capable male within the extended royal family. The system also required the subdivision of traditional territories among multiple heirs, rather than maintaining unified lordships under single rulers. These changes threatened to fragment the large territorial blocks that had enabled Gaelic lords to maintain military forces capable of resisting English expansion. Archaeological evidence from O'Neill strongholds of this period reveals the construction of new residential buildings designed according to English architectural principles, suggesting attempts to demonstrate cultural assimilation to Tudor authorities. The religious dimensions of Tudor policy in Ireland created additional pressures on Gaelic society that went beyond purely political considerations. Henry VIII's break with Rome and establishment of the Church of Ireland as a Protestant institution under royal supremacy directly challenged the Catholic faith that had become integral to Gaelic cultural identity. Irish monasteries, which had served as centres of learning and cultural preservation for over a millennium, faced dissolution and confiscation of their lands and treasures. The monastery at Clonmacnoise, which had survived Viking raids and Norman conquest, finally succumbed to Tudor officials who stripped its buildings of valuable materials and dispersed its library of irreplaceable manuscripts. The dissolution of Irish monasteries proceeded with bureaucratic efficiency that reflected the Tudor administration's systematic approach to cultural transformation. Royal commissioners conducted detailed inventories of monastic properties, cataloguing everything from silver chalices and illuminated manuscripts to cattle herds and agricultural equipment. The Valor Ecclesiasticus, compiled between 1535 and 1536, provides a comprehensive record of Irish ecclesiastical wealth that guided the confiscation process. Monasteries like Mellifont and Yearpoint, which had been major landowners and centres of agricultural innovation, were granted to English colonists who lacked both the knowledge and inclination to maintain their traditional functions. The cultural impact of monastic dissolution extended far beyond the loss of individual institutions. Irish monasteries had served as repositories of Gaelic historical traditions, genealogical records, and legal precedents that legitimised the political authority of native lords. The destruction of monastic libraries eliminated centuries of accumulated knowledge while depriving Gaelic society of the institutional framework that had preserved and transmitted its cultural heritage. Surviving manuscripts from this period revealed desperate attempts by Irish scholars to preserve their traditions, with scribes working in hiding to copy texts that were being systematically destroyed by Tudor authorities. The bardic schools that had flourished during the late medieval Gaelic revival found themselves under increasing pressure as their noble patrons either submitted to English authority or faced military conquest. The classical Irish literary tradition which had produced sophisticated poetry and historical works for over 4 centuries, began to decline as the social and economic foundations that supported professional poets disappeared. The last great bardic poets of this period, including Tadagdal O'Huigin and Eochaido Heodasa, composed elegiac verses that mourned not only the deaths of individual patrons, but the approaching end of an entire cultural world. The transformation of Dublin from a medieval trading centre into the administrative capital of English Ireland required extensive urban development that physically embodied Tudor ambitions for the island. Dublin Castle, extensively rebuilt during the 16th century, became the seat of the Lord Deputy and the centre of English administrative machinery in Ireland. The castle's new residential quarters, constructed according to Renaissance architectural principles, provided accommodation for English officials, while its expanded fortifications demonstrated royal power to potential Irish challengers. Archaeological excavation within the castle complex has revealed the remains of earlier medieval structures that were demolished to make way for Tudor buildings, symbolising the replacement of older political arrangements with centralised English authority. The establishment of King's Inns in Dublin created an institutional framework for training lawyers in English common law, gradually displacing the Brecon legal tradition that had governed Gaelic society for over a millennium. The curriculum at King's Inns emphasised Roman law principles and English legal precedents, while explicitly rejecting Irish customary law as barbarous and contrary to civilised governance. Students trained in this system became agents of cultural transformation, carrying English legal concepts into regions where Gaelic traditions had previously held sway. The surviving records of legal cases from this period reveal the systematic replacement of Brecon law with English common law, even in regions that remained under nominal Gaelic control. The 9 Years' War, which erupted in 1594 and continued until 1603, represented the final and most desperate attempt by Gaelic Ireland to preserve its political independence and cultural autonomy. The conflict's origins lay in the contradictions inherent in the surrender and regrant system, which had promised Gaelic lords continued authority over their territories, while simultaneously undermining the traditional foundations of their power. Hugh O'Neill, who had initially cooperated with English authorities and accepted the title Earl of Tyrone, gradually recognised that accommodation would ultimately result in the complete destruction of Gaelic political institutions. O'Neill's transformation from collaborative earl to rebel leader reflected the impossible position in which surrender and regrant had placed Gaelic lords. As Earl of Tyrone under English law, he was required to govern his territories according to English legal principles, collect taxes for the crown, and provide military service against other Irish lords who resisted English authority. However, his legitimacy among his own people depended on maintaining traditional Gaelic customs, protecting his followers from English encroachment, and preserving the cultural institutions that defined Ulster Irish identity. The tension between these conflicting obligations eventually forced O'Neill to choose between his English title and his role as defender of Gaelic civilization. The military preparations that preceded the outbreak of formal warfare demonstrated O'Neill's sophisticated understanding of contemporary European military technology and tactics. Unlike earlier Gaelic resistance movements, which had relied primarily on traditional weapons and guerrilla tactics, O'Neill's forces incorporated firearms, artillery, and disciplined infantry formations modelled on Spanish military practices. Archaeological excavation at O'Neill's strongholds has revealed evidence of gunpowder storage facilities, cannon emplacements, and workshops for manufacturing firearms and ammunition. The Earl's ability to equip and train modern military forces reflected both his personal wealth and his success in establishing diplomatic and commercial relationships with Spain and other Catholic powers. Red Hugh O'Donnell's parallel resistance in Connaught provided crucial support for O'Neill's Ulster-based rebellion while demonstrating the broad appeal of Gaelic resistance throughout Ireland. The young O'Donnell lord, who had endured years of captivity in Dublin Castle before escaping to assume leadership of his clan, brought both personal grievances and strategic vision to the anti-English coalition. His control of Tyrconnell provided secure bases for Spanish military assistance, while his alliance with O'Neill created a unified command structure capable of coordinating resistance across multiple provinces. The castle of Donegal, rebuilt by Red Hugh O'Donnell during the 1590s, exemplified the military architecture developed by Gaelic lords to resist Tudor conquest. The structure incorporated traditional Irish defensive concepts, with innovations derived from continental European fortress design, including angled bastions designed to accommodate artillery and carefully planned fields of fire that maximise defensive advantages. Archaeological investigation of the castle remains has revealed evidence of sophisticated construction techniques and imported building materials that demonstrate the resources available to Gaelic lords who maintained their independence during this period. The Battle of Clontibret in 1595 provided the first major test of O'Neill's modernised military forces against English troops equipped with contemporary weapons and tactics. The engagement occurred when an English relief column attempted to resupply the besieged garrison at Monaghan, forcing a confrontation in terrain that favoured Irish defensive tactics. O'Neill's forces, deployed in carefully prepared positions behind earthwork fortifications, demonstrated their ability to coordinate firearms with traditional weapons while maintaining the mobility that had always characterised Irish warfare. The English defeat, which cost them over 200 casualties including several senior officers, proved that properly equipped and trained Irish forces could match English troops in conventional battle. The victory at Clontibret encouraged other Gaelic lords throughout Ireland to join the rebellion, creating a general uprising that stretched English military resources beyond their capacity for effective response. The Burkes of Mayo, the O'Moores of Loire, and numerous other families that had previously accepted English authority now openly declared their support for O'Neill and O'Donnell. This expansion of the conflict from regional resistance to national rebellion reflected both the appeal of Gaelic leadership and the cumulative impact of Tudor policies that had systematically undermined traditional Irish society. The Spanish dimension of the 9 Years' War transformed what might have remained a local Irish rebellion into a theatre of the broader European conflict between Catholic Spain and Protestant England. Philip II of Spain, and later Philip III, recognised that supporting Irish resistance could divert English military resources from more direct threats to Spanish interests, while potentially creating opportunities for Catholic restoration in the British Isles. The Spanish court maintained diplomatic relations with O'Neill and O'Donnell through agents who negotiated agreements for military assistance and coordinated strategic planning. The arrival of Spanish forces at Kinsale in September 1601 represented the culmination of years of diplomatic negotiations and the last realistic opportunity for Gaelic Ireland to achieve military victory over English conquest. The Spanish expedition, commanded by Don Juan del Aguila, consisted of approximately 3,400 infantry equipped with the most modern weapons available to European armies. These troops established themselves in the fortified town of Kinsale, creating a secure base for operations while awaiting the arrival of Irish allies who would provide the local knowledge and additional manpower necessary for successful campaigns against English strongholds. The tactical challenges facing the Irish-Spanish alliance at Kinsale reflected the broader strategic problems that had plagued Gaelic resistance throughout the Tudor period. Spanish military doctrine emphasised formal siege warfare and set-piece battles that utilised the superior training and equipment of professional European armies. Irish tactical traditions, by contrast, favoured mobility, surprise attacks, and the exploitation of difficult terrain that negated enemy advantages in equipment and training. The coordination of these different military approaches required careful planning and mutual understanding that proved difficult to achieve under the pressure of English countermeasures. Lord Deputy Mountjoy's response to the Spanish landing demonstrated the administrative and military capabilities that the Tudor state had developed during decades of Irish warfare. Within weeks of receiving intelligence about the Spanish arrival, English forces had surrounded Kinsale with siege lines that prevented Spanish expansion while maintaining pressure on the town's defences. The speed and efficiency of this response reflected both improved English logistics and intelligence networks that had been systematically developed during years of conflict with Irish resistance. The Battle of Kinsale, fought on January 3rd, 1602, unfolded as a complex engagement involving 3 separate armies manoeuvring in difficult winter conditions. O'Neill and O'Donnell, leading combined Irish forces estimated at over 6,000 men, attempted to coordinate their attack with a Spanish sortie from the town that would catch the English besiegers between 2 hostile forces. However, the tactical coordination required for such complex operations proved beyond the capabilities of forces that had limited experience working together and faced communication difficulties in the darkness and confusion of early morning combat. The Irish attack began before dawn, with O'Neill's Ulster forces advancing against the English siege lines, while O'Donnell's Connaught troops moved to support the assault. The initial Irish advance achieved tactical surprise and broke through the first line of English defences, creating opportunities for the Spanish garrison to sally forth and complete the destruction of Mountjoy's army. However, communication failures prevented effective coordination between the Irish and Spanish forces, allowing the English to recover from their initial surprise and reorganise their defences. Archaeological investigation of the battlefield has revealed evidence of the fierce fighting that occurred, including musket balls, cannon shot, and fragments of weapons that testify to the intensity of the engagement. The collapse of the Irish attack at Kinsale occurred when O'Donnell's cavalry, advancing in support of O'Neill's infantry, encountered unexpected English resistance and broke in disorder. The retreat of the Connaught forces exposed O'Neill's flank to English counterattack, forcing the Ulster army to withdraw to avoid encirclement. The Spanish garrison, observing the Irish retreat, abandoned their planned sortie and remained within Kinsale's defences. The tactical defeat, though not involving catastrophic casualties for the Irish forces, effectively ended any realistic prospect of military victory over English conquest. The surrender of the Spanish garrison at Kinsale in January 1602 eliminated the last external support for Gaelic resistance, while demonstrating to Irish lords throughout the country that continued opposition to English authority was futile. The terms negotiated between Don Juan de la Guila and Lord Deputy Mountjoy allowed the Spanish forces to depart with military honours, but provided no protection for their Irish allies who had committed themselves to the rebellion. This abandonment of Irish supporters reflected Spanish priorities that placed European strategic considerations above the fate of their Gaelic allies. The final phases of the 9 Years' War consisted primarily of mopping up operations as English forces systematically reduced the remaining centres of Irish resistance. O'Neill's retreat to his Ulster strongholds prolonged the conflict for another year, but the Earl's military position had become hopeless following the defeat at Kinsale and the withdrawal of Spanish support. The scorched earth tactics employed by English forces during this period created widespread famine and social disruption that broke the will of Irish communities to continue supporting resistance. Archaeological evidence from Ulster settlements of this period reveals widespread destruction and abandonment that reflects the devastating impact of these final military operations. The Treaty of Mellifont, signed on March 30th, 1603, formally ended the 9 Years' War and marked the effective conclusion of organised Gaelic resistance to English conquest. The terms negotiated between O'Neill and Mountjoy appeared relatively generous, allowing the Earl to retain his territories and title while accepting English authority and Protestant religious establishment. However, the treaty's provisions for English garrisons, legal reform, and administrative oversight effectively eliminated the autonomy that had enabled Gaelic lords to maintain their traditional political and cultural institutions. The flight of the Earls on September 4th, 1607, represented the final acknowledgement by Gaelic leadership that accommodation with English authority was impossible without the complete abandonment of Irish cultural identity. O'Neill, O'Donnell and their principal followers, totalling nearly 100 individuals from the most prominent Ulster families, departed from Rathmullen in County Donegal aboard a ship bound for the Spanish Netherlands. Contemporary accounts describe emotional scenes as the earls took leave of followers who would remain behind to face an uncertain future under English rule. The departure of these traditional leaders eliminated the political and cultural focus around which Irish resistance might have reorganised, effectively decapitating Gaelic society in its most important stronghold. The Ulster plantation that followed the flight of the earls represented the most systematic colonisation scheme attempted anywhere in early modern Europe. The confiscation of approximately 3.8 million acres of the finest land in Ireland provided opportunities for English and Scottish settlers while permanently altering the demographic balance in Ulster. The plantation's architects designed a comprehensive settlement scheme that included not only individual grants to colonists, but also the establishment of market towns, Protestant churches, and defensive fortifications that would create a self-sustaining colonial society capable of resisting Irish attempts at reconquest. The surveys conducted to facilitate the Ulster plantation provide detailed records of the Gaelic society that was being systematically destroyed. The escheated counties of Donegal, Tyrone, Armagh, Fermanagh, Cavan and Coleraine were mapped and evaluated with unprecedented precision, revealing the sophisticated agricultural systems and settlement patterns that had supported Gaelic civilization. These surveys documented not only the physical landscape, but also the cultural features that would be eliminated through plantation, including traditional place names, ceremonial sites, and the locations of schools and religious centres that had maintained Irish cultural traditions. The allocation of plantation lands followed principles designed to prevent the reconstitution of Gaelic political authority, while ensuring the economic success of colonial settlement. Large estates were granted to English and Scottish undertakers, who committed to bringing specified numbers of Protestant tenants and establishing defended settlements within prescribed timeframes. Smaller grants to servitors who had participated in the conquest provided rewards for military service, while creating a class of colonial landowners with direct interests in maintaining English authority. The exclusion of native Irish from land ownership in the planted counties eliminated the economic foundation that had supported traditional Gaelic lordship. The town of Londonderry, established by the London companies as the commercial centre of the Ulster plantation, exemplified the urban development that accompanied systematic colonisation. The city's walls, constructed between 1613 and 1619, created one of the finest examples of early modern military architecture in the British Isles, while symbolising the permanence of English settlement in Ulster. Archaeological investigation of the city's early development reveals the rapid construction of Protestant churches, market facilities, and residential areas designed according to English urban planning principles. The transformation of the ancient ecclesiastical site of Derry into a commercial and administrative centre for Protestant colonists symbolised the broader cultural revolution that plantation represented. The cultural destruction that accompanied the Ulster plantation extended beyond the confiscation of land to encompass the systematic suppression of Gaelic language, law, and educational institutions. The Irish language was banned from official use and discouraged in private contexts, while English became the exclusive medium of legal proceedings, commercial transactions, and formal education. The bardic schools that had preserved classical modern Irish literary traditions found themselves without patrons or students, leading to the rapid decline of sophisticated Gaelic literary culture. Archaeological evidence from former bardic school sites reveals their abandonment during the early 17th century, with valuable manuscripts and teaching materials scattered or destroyed. The collapse of the Brecon legal system eliminated the institutional framework that had regulated Gaelic society for over a millennium. English common law, imposed throughout the planted counties, recognised neither the complex kinship obligations nor the collective property rights that had formed the foundation of traditional Irish social organisation. Legal proceedings conducted in English by judges trained in English law schools created barriers that effectively excluded Irish participation in the judicial system that now governed their lives. The survival of Gaelic legal manuscripts from this period reveals desperate attempts by Irish legal scholars to preserve their traditions, but the social context that had given these laws practical relevance had been permanently destroyed. The religious dimension of cultural suppression involved the systematic replacement of Catholic clergy with Protestant ministers and the conversion of Irish churches to Protestant use. The penal laws enacted during this period prohibited Catholic religious practices while requiring attendance at Protestant services. Irish Catholic clergy faced imprisonment or exile, while the educational institutions that had trained them were closed or converted to Protestant use. The destruction of Irish religious culture eliminated not only spiritual practices, but also the institutional framework that had preserved Irish historical traditions and cultural identity. The demographic transformation of Ulster through plantation created a colonial society that would permanently alter the character of Irish civilization. The introduction of approximately 100,000 Protestant settlers during the first generation of plantation overwhelmed the remaining Irish population in many areas, while creating segregated communities that maintained distinct cultural identities. Archaeological evidence from plantation settlements reveals the construction of distinctly English and Scottish architectural forms that contrasted sharply with traditional Irish building techniques, creating visible symbols of cultural displacement. The economic systems established by plantation settlers introduced agricultural techniques and commercial practices that increased productivity while destroying traditional Irish economic relationships. The replacement of cattle-based pastoral systems with intensive grain cultivation required different labour patterns and social organisations that had no place for traditional Gaelic social hierarchies. The establishment of market towns with Protestant merchants and English legal systems created commercial networks that excluded Irish participation while extracting wealth from Irish territories for the benefit of colonial settlers. The resistance that developed in response to plantation took forms that reflected the desperate circumstances facing dispossessed Irish populations. The Wood Kern, displaced Irish, who took to banditry and guerrilla warfare, represented a degenerate form of traditional warrior culture that lacked the political leadership and popular support that had characterised earlier resistance movements. Archaeological evidence from remote upland areas reveals temporary camps and weapon caches that suggest organised resistance activities, but these efforts lacked the resources and coordination necessary to challenge the plantation system effectively. The cultural impact of the Tudor conquest and plantation extended far beyond the immediate destruction of Gaelic political institutions. The elimination of traditional Irish lordship, legal systems and educational institutions created a cultural catastrophe from which Gaelic civilization would never fully recover. The sophisticated literary tradition that had flourished during the late medieval period disappeared within a generation, while the oral traditions that had preserved Irish historical memory faced systematic suppression. The transformation of Ireland from a Gaelic cultural homeland into a colonial territory represented one of the most complete cultural conquests in European history, establishing patterns of domination and resistance that would influence Irish society for centuries to come. The systematic destruction of Gaelic political and cultural institutions during the Tudor conquest created conditions that would drive millions of Irish people from their ancestral homeland over the following centuries. The demographic catastrophe that began with the Ulster plantation intensified dramatically during the 1840s, when the potato blight triggered the most devastating famine in Irish recorded history. Between 1845 and 1852, approximately 1 million Irish died from starvation and disease, while another 2 million emigrated, fundamentally altering the demographic composition of Ireland, while creating vast Gaelic communities across the Atlantic world. The Great Famine represented not merely a natural disaster, but the culmination of colonial policies that had systematically impoverished the Irish population, while making them dependent on a single crop for survival. The conditions that made the Irish population vulnerable to famine reflected centuries of land confiscation and economic marginalisation. By the early 19th century, most Irish Catholics had been reduced to tenant farmers working tiny plots of poor quality land under lease agreements that provided minimal security and extracted maximum profit for absentee English landlords. The subdivision of holdings to accommodate population growth had created a rural economy where families survived on plots as small as 1 or 2 acres, cultivating potatoes that could produce more calories per acre than any other available crop. Archaeological evidence from pre-famine Irish cottages reveals the primitive living conditions that characterised rural Ireland, with single-room stone dwellings housing extended families alongside their livestock. The potato varieties grown in Ireland during the early 19th century lacked the genetic diversity that might have provided resistance to disease. The Irish lumper, which comprised approximately 1/3 of all potatoes grown in Ireland, proved particularly susceptible to Phytophthora infestans, the fungal pathogen that caused the blight. When the disease first appeared in Irish potato fields during September 1845, it spread with devastating speed across the island's interconnected agricultural regions. Contemporary accounts describe the horror of farmers who discovered their apparently healthy potato crops had turned black and putrid within days, eliminating the food supply that sustained millions of people. The British government's response to the famine reflected both ideological commitment to free market economics and deep-seated prejudices against the Irish population. Prime Minister Robert Peel's initial relief efforts, which included the importation of Indian corn and the establishment of public works projects, provided limited assistance but were discontinued when Lord John Russell's Liberal government took power in 1846. Russell's administration, influenced by Treasury official Charles Trevelyan, viewed the famine as divine punishment for Irish moral failings and an opportunity to modernise Irish agriculture through the elimination of surplus population. The government's refusal to prohibit food exports from Ireland while millions starved demonstrated the colonial relationship that subordinated Irish welfare to British economic interests. The workhouse system established under the Irish Poor Law of 1838 became a mechanism of social control during the famine rather than effective relief for the starving population. These institutions, designed according to utilitarian principles that made relief as unpleasant as possible to discourage dependence, require the destitute to abandon their homes and separate from their families in exchange for minimal food and shelter. Archaeological excavation at former workhouse sites has revealed the overcrowded and unsanitary conditions that prevailed during the famine years, with mass graves containing hundreds of bodies buried without coffins or proper funeral rites. The Skibbereen Workhouse in County Cork, which housed over 10,000 people in facilities designed for 800, exemplified the system's complete breakdown under famine conditions. The emigration that began as a desperate flight from starvation evolved into organised population movements that established permanent Irish communities throughout the English-speaking world. The coffin ships that carried Irish emigrants across the Atlantic earned their grim nickname from the appalling mortality rates that characterised these voyages. Vessels designed to carry cargo were hastily converted to transport human passengers with minimal provisions for sanitation, fresh water, or adequate food supplies. Ship manifests from the period reveal mortality rates exceeding 20% on some voyages, with typhus and dysentery spreading rapidly through overcrowded holds where families were confined for weeks without adequate ventilation or medical care. The port of New York became the primary destination for Irish emigrants, with Castle Garden and later Ellis Island processing hundreds of thousands of arrivals who carried little more than the clothes they wore. The Irish neighbourhoods that developed in Lower Manhattan, particularly the Five Points district, became notorious for their poverty, overcrowding and social problems that reflected the desperate circumstances of recent arrivals. Archaeological investigation of 19th century Irish tenements has revealed the material conditions of immigrant life, with multiple families sharing single rooms and evidence of malnutrition and disease that persisted long after arrival in America. The Irish who survived the Atlantic crossing faced discrimination from established American populations, who viewed them as racially inferior and religiously suspect. The development of Irish-American political organisations provided mechanisms for collective advancement while maintaining connections to the homeland. Tammany Hall in New York became the most powerful Irish-American political machine, using patronage and electoral mobilisation to secure political influence for Irish immigrants while providing essential services that government agencies failed to deliver. The success of Irish politicians like Honest John Kelly and Richard Croker demonstrated the potential for political organisation to overcome ethnic discrimination, though their methods often involve corruption and violence that reinforce negative stereotypes about Irish character. The political networks established by Irish Americans would later provide crucial support for Irish independence movements, with organisations like Clan na Gael raising funds and purchasing weapons for Republican activities in Ireland. The construction of America's transportation infrastructure provided employment opportunities that enabled Irish immigrants to escape urban poverty while spreading Irish communities across the continent. The building of canals, railroads and urban infrastructure required massive amounts of manual labour that Irish workers provided, despite dangerous working conditions and discriminatory wages. The construction of the Erie Canal employed thousands of Irish labourers who worked with primitive tools in disease-infested swamps, earning the canal its nickname as an Irish grave. Archaeological evidence from construction camps reveals the harsh living conditions endured by Irish workers, with temporary shelters, inadequate sanitation, and high mortality rates from accidents and disease. The California gold rush of 1849 attracted thousands of Irish emigrants who sought opportunities unavailable in eastern cities. The journey to California, whether by ship around Cape Horn or overland across the American continent, required resources and determination that only the most ambitious emigrants possessed. Irish miners in the California goldfields faced discrimination from American prospectors while competing for claims in remote mountain regions, where survival depended on individual resourcefulness and community cooperation. The establishment of Irish settlements in California created cultural outposts that maintained Gaelic traditions while adapting to frontier conditions that bore little resemblance to rural Ireland. The development of Irish communities in Australia followed patterns similar to those in North America, but occurred under different circumstances that shape their character and relationship to Irish identity. The transportation of Irish convicts to Australia beginning in the late 18th century created involuntary Irish settlements that preserved Gaelic cultural traditions while developing distinctive Australian characteristics. The Irish who arrived as free emigrants during the 19th century encountered established Irish Australian communities that provided support networks while maintaining connections to political and cultural movements in Ireland. Archaeological evidence from Irish settlements in Australia reveals the adaptation of traditional building techniques to local materials and climatic conditions, creating hybrid architectural forms that reflected both Irish heritage and Australian innovation. The Catholic Church played a crucial role in maintaining Irish cultural identity throughout the diaspora, while providing institutional frameworks for community organisation and mutual support. Irish priests who emigrated with their parishioners established parishes that served as centres of Irish cultural life, conducting services in Irish when possible and maintaining traditions that connected immigrant communities to their homeland. The construction of Catholic churches in Irish neighbourhoods created visible symbols of community identity, while providing spaces for cultural activities that preserved Irish music, dance and storytelling traditions. The parochial school systems established by Irish American Catholics ensured that Irish cultural traditions would be transmitted to subsequent generations, while providing education that enabled social mobility. The preservation of Irish musical traditions in diaspora communities created cultural forms that would later influence popular music throughout the English-speaking world. Irish musicians who emigrated during the famine period brought traditional instruments, including fiddles, pipes, and bodhrán drums, that became central to Irish-American musical culture. The adaptation of traditional Irish melodies to American instruments and performance contexts created new musical forms that maintained Irish characteristics, while incorporating influences from other immigrant communities. The development of Irish-American dance traditions, particularly step dancing and set dancing, provided community entertainment while preserving cultural practices that connected diaspora communities to their Irish origins. The revival of interest in Gaelic culture during the late 19th century emerged simultaneously in Ireland, and diaspora communities as educated Irish people sought to recover traditions that had been suppressed or abandoned during centuries of colonial rule. The Gaelic League, founded in Dublin in 1893 by Douglas Hyde and Eowyn MacNeill, promoted the preservation and revival of the Irish language while encouraging the collection and publication of traditional Irish literature, music, and folklore. The organisation's non-political stance initially attracted support from both nationalist and unionist Irish people, who shared concerns about the decline of distinctive Irish cultural traditions under the influence of English education and popular culture. Douglas Hyde's presidential address to the Irish National Literary Society in 1892, entitled "The Necessity for De-Anglicising Ireland," articulated the cultural nationalist philosophy that would guide the Gaelic revival movement. Hyde argued that Irish political independence would be meaningless without the recovery of distinctive Irish cultural traditions that had been systematically suppressed during centuries of English rule. His call for the revival of Irish language, literature, sports, and customs resonated with educated Irish people who had observed the rapid decline of traditional culture during the 19th century. The speech's influence extended beyond Ireland to Irish communities throughout the diaspora, inspiring cultural revival activities that connected emigrant populations to their ancestral homeland. The Gaelic League's language classes attracted thousands of students who sought to learn Irish, despite having no practical need for the language in their daily lives. The classes, conducted in schools, churches and community centres throughout Ireland and in Irish communities abroad, used teaching methods adapted from modern language instruction, while emphasising the cultural and historical significance of Irish. The League's publications, including the newspaper and Cléad Am Soloís, provided reading materials for Irish learners while promoting cultural activities that would strengthen Irish identity. Archaeological evidence from Gaelic League meeting places reveals the grassroots nature of the language revival, with simple facilities in rural areas attracting participants from surrounding communities who gathered to learn their ancestral language. The collection and publication of Irish folklore during the Gaelic revival preserved oral traditions that might otherwise have been lost as traditional Irish-speaking communities disappeared. Collectors like Jeremiah Curtin and Lady Gregory travelled throughout the Irish-speaking regions recording stories, songs and customs that had been transmitted orally for generations. Their work documented not only entertainment traditions, but also historical memories, legal customs, and religious beliefs that provided insights into pre-conquest Gaelic society. The folklore collections published during this period created literary resources that would influence Irish writers while preserving cultural materials that demonstrated the sophistication of traditional Irish civilization. The Gaelic Athletic Association, founded in 1884 by Michael Cusack and Maurice Davin, promoted traditional Irish sports as alternatives to English games that had become popular in Irish schools and communities. The organisation's emphasis on hurling, Gaelic football, and other distinctively Irish sports provided recreational activities that reinforced Irish cultural identity while creating competitive frameworks that attracted participants throughout Ireland and the diaspora. The GAA's ban on members participating in foreign sports reflected the cultural nationalist belief that Irish people should reject English cultural influences in favour of authentic Irish traditions. Archaeological investigation of early GAA grounds reveals the community effort required to create playing fields and facilities that could accommodate traditional Irish sports. The Highland Land League in Scotland emerged during the 1880s as a political movement that combined demands for land reform with assertions of Highland cultural identity. The organisation's campaigns against landlord abuses drew inspiration from the Irish Land War, while addressing specifically Scottish concerns about the clearances that had depopulated Highland communities during the 18th and 19th centuries. The Crofters Act of 1886, which secured tenant rights and established the Crofters Commission, represented a significant victory for Highland political organisation while providing legal protections that enabled the survival of Gaelic-speaking communities in the Scottish Highlands and Islands. The cultural dimensions of Highland political activism included efforts to preserve and revive Scottish Gaelic language and traditions that had been suppressed following the Battle of Culloden in 1746. The establishment of An Cumann Gaid Hairlach in 1891 provided institutional support for Gaelic cultural activities, including the national mod competitions that celebrated Highland music, poetry and dance. These cultural festivals attracted participants from throughout the Scottish Highlands and from Scottish communities in Canada and Australia, creating networks of cultural exchange that maintained Highland identity across vast geographical distances. The revival of interest in Highland dress, music and customs during this period reflected both romantic nostalgia and genuine efforts to preserve traditions that remained vital parts of Highland community life. The political dimensions of cultural revival became increasingly evident as the Gaelic League and similar organisations attracted members who viewed cultural nationalism as preparation for political independence. The League's insistence on non-political status became difficult to maintain as its activities inevitably challenged the colonial relationship that subordinated Irish culture to English authority. The organisation's promotion of Irish language education, for example, directly contradicted government policies that required English-only instruction in Irish schools. The League's cultural festivals and competitions created spaces where Irish identity could be celebrated and reinforced, providing alternatives to the anglicised popular culture that dominated Irish urban areas. The Easter Rising of 1916 demonstrated the connection between cultural revival and political nationalism, with several Gaelic League leaders participating in the rebellion that proclaimed Irish independence. Patrick Pearse, who had been a prominent figure in the Irish language movement, commanded the rebel forces at the General Post Office, while Eamon de Valera, another League member, led the garrison at Boland's Mill. The proclamation of the Irish Republic, read by Pearse on the steps of the GPO, was written in both Irish and English, symbolising the cultural nationalist belief that political independence required the recovery of distinctive Irish traditions. The execution of the Rising's leaders by British authorities transformed them into martyrs for both political and cultural nationalism, inspiring subsequent generations of Irish activists. The establishment of the Irish Free State in 1922 provided opportunities to implement cultural nationalist policies that had been advocated by the Gaelic revival movement. The new state's constitution recognised Irish as the national language, while requiring its teaching in all schools receiving government funding. The creation of the Gaeltacht officially designated Irish-speaking regions that received special government support, attempted to preserve the remaining native Irish-speaking communities while providing models for language revival throughout the country. Archaeological evidence from Gaeltacht regions reveals the impact of government policies designed to maintain traditional Irish culture, including the construction of Irish language schools and the establishment of industries that would provide employment for Irish speakers. The development of Irish language media during the 20th century provided new mechanisms for cultural transmission, while adapting traditional forms to modern communication technologies. Radio Ariane's Irish language programming, beginning in the 1920s, brought Irish music, stories and news to audiences throughout Ireland and the diaspora. The establishment of Radio na Gaeltachta in 1972 created a dedicated Irish language radio service that served native speakers while providing programming for Irish learners throughout the country. Television programming in Irish, beginning with occasional programmes in the 1960s and expanding to the dedicated channel TG4 in 1996, demonstrated the potential for modern media to support minority language communities while creating new forms of Irish language culture. The challenges facing Irish language revival efforts reflected broader patterns of modernisation and globalisation that threatened minority languages throughout the world. The decline of traditional Irish-speaking communities continued despite government support, as young people emigrated to English-speaking areas in search of economic opportunities. The urbanisation of Irish society created environments where English dominated while Irish remained associated with rural areas that many Irish people viewed as backward or economically marginal. The influence of English language mass media, particularly television and popular music, provided cultural alternatives that many young Irish people found more attractive than traditional Irish culture. The development of Irish language education outside the Gael tacht represented one of the most successful aspects of language revival efforts. The establishment of Gaels Cúailnge, Irish language primary schools, in urban areas throughout Ireland demonstrated parental demand for Irish language education while creating new communities of Irish speakers. These schools, which taught all subjects through Irish, except for English language classes, produce graduates who are fluent in Irish while fully participating in modern Irish society. The success of Irish medium education inspired similar programmes in Northern Ireland, where Irish language schools provided alternatives to the segregated Protestant and Catholic school systems while asserting Irish cultural identity in a contested political environment. The peace process in Northern Ireland during the 1990s created new opportunities for Irish cultural expression, while recognising the rights of both nationalist and unionist communities. The Good Friday Agreement of 1998 acknowledged the importance of Irish language and culture while providing frameworks for their promotion that respected unionist concerns about political neutrality. The establishment of Fóras na Gaeilge as a cross-border body responsible for Irish language promotion demonstrated the potential for cultural cooperation between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland despite their different political systems. The development of Irish language broadcasting, education and cultural activities in Northern Ireland provided alternatives to the polarised political identities that had dominated the region during the Troubles. The relationship between modern Ireland and its Gaelic heritage reflects ongoing tensions between cultural authenticity and economic modernisation. The transformation of Ireland into a prosperous European Union member state during the late 20th century created opportunities for Irish cultural expression while challenging traditional assumptions about Irish identity. The success of Irish popular music, literature and film in international markets demonstrated the global appeal of Irish creativity, while raising questions about the relationship between commercial success and cultural authenticity. The development of cultural tourism that marketed Irish heritage to international visitors created economic incentives for preserving Irish traditions, while potentially transforming them into commodified entertainment for foreign consumption. The Irish language's status as an official language of the European Union, achieved in 2007, provided international recognition for Irish cultural rights, while creating practical challenges for translation and interpretation services. The symbolic importance of this recognition extended beyond practical considerations to demonstrate Ireland's success in maintaining distinctive cultural traditions despite centuries of suppression and marginalisation. The development of Irish language terminology for modern technical and professional fields reflected ongoing efforts to adapt traditional languages to contemporary needs while maintaining their distinctive characteristics. The digital revolution of the early 21st century created new opportunities for Irish language and culture, while posing additional challenges for traditional forms of cultural transmission. The development of Irish language websites, social media platforms, and digital archives provided global access to Irish cultural materials while enabling Irish speakers throughout the world to maintain contact with each other. The creation of online Irish language courses and resources democratised access to Irish learning while reducing the geographical barriers that had previously limited Irish language education. However, the dominance of English in digital communications created additional pressure on minority languages, while the rapid pace of technological change challenged traditional approaches to language planning and cultural preservation. The contemporary challenges facing Gaelic culture in both Ireland and Scotland reflect broader global patterns of cultural homogenisation and minority language endangerment. Despite government support and cultural revival efforts, the number of native Irish and Scottish Gaelic speakers continues to decline as traditional communities face economic pressures and cultural competition from English language media and education. The success of Irish and Scottish cultural expression in international contexts, including music, literature and film, demonstrates the continued vitality of Gaelic creativity while raising questions about the relationship between cultural heritage and contemporary identity. The story of the Gaels, from their origins in prehistoric Europe through their contemporary struggles to maintain cultural distinctiveness in a globalised world, represents one of the most remarkable examples of cultural persistence and adaptation in human history. Despite conquest, colonisation, famine and emigration, Gaelic communities have maintained connections to their ancestral traditions, while creating new forms of cultural expression that reflect their experiences in diverse geographical and political contexts. The survival of Irish and Scottish Gaelic languages, the persistence of traditional music and storytelling, and the continued identification of millions of people throughout the world with their Gaelic heritage testify to the enduring power of cultural identity to transcend political boundaries and historical catastrophes. The future of Gaelic culture depends on the ability of contemporary communities to balance preservation of traditional forms with adaptation to modern circumstances. The success of Irish language education, the vitality of traditional music scenes, and the continued production of literature and media in Irish and Scottish Gaelic provide reasons for optimism about cultural survival. However, the ongoing challenges of globalisation, urbanisation, and economic change require continued innovation in approaches to cultural transmission and community building. The experience of the Gaels over more than 2 millennia demonstrates both the fragility and resilience of human cultures, offering lessons about the importance of community solidarity, cultural creativity and political organisation in maintaining distinctive identities in the face of overwhelming pressures for conformity and assimilation.